At my son's wedding, which I paid for entirely using what he thought was my life savings, his new wife introduced me to her wealthy family with a microphone in her hand. She pointed right at me and said, "This is the old fat pig we have to put up with." They all laughed, clinking their crystal glasses. They had no idea that the man they were mocking wasn't just a retired mechanic. They didn't know I was the new owner of her father's company. Before I tell you how I fired her father and evicted the newlyweds from my house, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been underestimated by people who thought they were better than you. The air in the ballroom of the Platinum Sands Resort smelled like expensive lilies and old money. It was a scent I had learned to recognize over the years, a mixture of heavy perfume and arrogance. I stood in the far corner near the service entrance holding a glass of sparkling water, because the champagne they were serving cost more per bottle than my first car. I adjusted the collar of my suit. It was a charcoal gray suit I had bought off the rack at a department store 5 years ago. It was clean and pressed, but in this room full of custom Italian silk and tailored tuxedos, I looked like the help. I watched the guests mingle. They were the elite of the city friends of the bride's family, the Sterlings. They moved in tight circles, their laughter sharp and loud. No one spoke to me. Occasionally a gaze would sweep over me, pause for a fraction of a second to register my dark skin and my cheap suit, and then slide away as if I were a smudge on the wallpaper. I didn't mind the isolation. I have spent my life building an empire from the shadows, learning that the loudest person in the room is rarely the one with the real power. What hurt was seeing my son Trey. He was standing near the head table laughing at something his father-in-law Richard Sterling was saying. Trey looked handsome in his tuxedo, but he looked small next to Richard. Every time Richard clapped a hand on Trey's shoulder, my son flinched slightly. A nervous smile plastered on his face. Trey had spent his entire life trying to scrub away the scent of motor oil and hard work that he associated with me. He wanted to belong to this world of easy money and country clubs. He didn't know that I had just spent $85,000 of hard-earned cash to pay for this wedding because he had begged me. He told me that the Sterlings expected a certain standard and he couldn't afford it. I gave him the money. I let him believe it was everything I had saved from 40 years of fixing transmissions and changing oil. I felt a heavy envelope in the inside pocket of my jacket. It contained a cashier's check for $100,000. It was my wedding gift to them. A down payment for a house so they wouldn't have to live in mine anymore. I wanted to surprise them. I wanted to see my son look at me with pride just for once. The music lowered and the best man tapped a spoon against a glass. The room fell silent. It was time for the speeches. Richard Sterling took the microphone first. He was a large man, red-faced from too much scotch, wearing a suit that probably cost $5,000. He owned the regional branch of Vanguard Tech, a company that had been struggling for months. He didn't know Vanguard Tech had been quietly acquired last week by a holding company called Mercer Equity. He didn't know the signature on the acquisition papers was mine. Richard boomed into the microphone talking about his beautiful daughter Paige. He talked about legacy, about excellence, about how the Sterling name was a pillar of the community. He barely mentioned Trey, only referring to him as the lucky man who gets to join our dynasty. He didn't look at me once. To him, I was invisible. I was just the father of the boy who married up. Then Paige took the microphone. My new daughter-in-law looked stunning in a designer gown that cost more than the down payment on my first shop, but her eyes were glassy. She had been drinking since the ceremony. She leaned into her father, giggling before turning to the crowd. She thanked her friends, her bridesmaids, and her daddy for being her hero. Then her eyes scanned the room and landed on me in the corner. Her smile twisted into something cruel. She pointed a manicured finger at me. And over there, hiding in the corner, is Trey's dad, Silas. We are so generous to invite him. Everyone meet the old fat pig we have to put up with. The silence that followed lasted only a heartbeat before the laughter started. It wasn't nervous laughter. It was genuine mocking laughter. The guests covered their mouths, whispering to each other, looking at me with amusement. Paige wasn't finished. She giggled into the microphone, her voice slurring slightly. Seriously, look at him. He smells like grease and Old Spice, but Trey promised me he stays in the basement so he won't ruin our aesthetic. Right, baby. She looked at Trey. This was the moment. This was the moment my son could have stepped up. He could have taken the microphone. He could have told her to stop. He could have defended the man who raised him alone after his mother died, the man who worked 16-hour days so he could go to college. I locked eyes with my son across the room. I saw him hesitate. I saw the fear in his eyes. He looked at Richard, who was wheezing with laughter. He looked at Paige, who was waiting for his approval. And then Trey laughed. It was a weak, hollow sound, but it was a laugh. He raised his glass toward me, shrugging his shoulders as if to say, "What can I do?" and joined in the mockery of his own father. That laugh broke something inside me that I didn't think could ever be broken. It wasn't my heart. My heart had hardened years ago when I buried my wife. It was my mercy. The tether of fatherly obligation that had made me tolerate their disrespect for years snapped. I stood perfectly still. I didn't storm out. I didn't shout. I kept my face completely expressionless, the mask of the simple, dull-witted mechanic they thought I was. But under the table, my hand went into my jacket pocket. My fingers closed around the thick envelope. The check for $100,000, the seed money for their future. I pulled it out slowly, keeping it below the level of the table where no one could see. With precise, deliberate movements, I tore the envelope in half. Then I put the halves together and tore them again. I repeated this until the check was nothing but confetti in my sweaty palm. I dropped the pieces onto the carpeted floor and ground them into the fabric with the heel of my worn-out dress shoe. The speeches ended and the music swelled again. The guests returned to their conversations, the moment of cruelty already forgotten, just a bit of entertainment with their dinner. I pulled my phone from my pocket. It was an old model cracked screen, part of my disguise. But it sent messages just as well as the newest smartphone. I opened my secure messaging app and found the contact labeled Aria. Aria Vance was my lead attorney and the only person in this city who knew exactly how many zeros were in my bank account. I typed a single message. Audit everything. The house, the cars, the accounts I put in Trey's name. Prepare the transfer documents for Vanguard Tech. We are cleaning house. I hit send and watched the little check mark appear. It was done. The gears of my real life, the life of Silas Mercer, CEO of Mercer Equity, were beginning to turn. I saw Paige coming toward me a few minutes later. She was holding a glass of wine, swaying slightly on her heels. She didn't look sorry. She looked empowered by the applause she had received. She stopped a foot away from me, wrinkling her nose as if she really could smell motor oil on my dry-cleaned suit. "You know I was just joking, right, Silas?" she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness but her eyes cold as ice. "But seriously, try not to talk to anyone important. You're embarrassing Trey. Just eat your free dinner and go back to the basement. You make the photos look cheap." She turned on her heel and walked away, her white dress swishing behind her. I watched her go. I watched her walk back to Trey, who kissed her on the cheek, accepting her abuse because he was too weak to stand alone. I looked down at the plate of cold chicken they had placed on the service table for me. I didn't eat. I placed my glass of water down on the table with a soft clink. They called me a pig. They forgot that wild pigs are smart, tough, and when you corner them, they can tear you apart. I walked toward the exit, passing the table where Richard Sterling was holding court, bragging about his future. He didn't notice me leaving. As I stepped out into the cool night air, the valet looked at me with pity. "Can I get your truck, sir?" he asked. He meant my 20-year-old rusted Ford pickup, the one I drove to keep up appearances. "No," I said, my voice deep and steady, shedding the stuttering persona I used around my son. "I'll walk." I needed the fresh air. I needed to clear my head before I went back to the house that I owned, the house where they made me sleep in the basement. I had a lot of work to do. The wedding was over. The war had just begun. The morning sun was barely peeking through the curtains of the 4-bedroom colonial house I had purchased 15 years ago when the sound of a zipper tearing open shattered the silence. It was followed by the heavy thud of a suitcase hitting the floorboards. I stood in the hallway holding a cup of black coffee, watching my new daughter-in-law Paige dragging my belongings out of the master bedroom. She wasn't folding my clothes or placing them gently into boxes. She was shoving them into black garbage bags as if they were contaminated waste from a hospital. "Move it, Trey," she barked at my son, who was struggling with a box of my books. "I don't want his old man smell lingering in here when my friends come over for the housewarming party." I took a sip of coffee, the liquid bitter on my tongue. Just yesterday at the wedding, they had smiled for the cameras. They had accepted the envelopes of cash from guests. They had played the part of the happy couple starting a life together. But the honeymoon was apparently over before it had even begun. We had returned to the house late last night. I had gone to sleep in my room, the master suite I had slept in alone since my wife passed. But this morning the regime change had begun. Paige stopped when she saw me standing there. She didn't look embarrassed. She looked annoyed. She smoothed her silk robe, a gift I knew Trey had bought with the credit card I paid off every month. "Good you are awake," she said, her voice sharp and devoid of any warmth. "We need to establish some ground rules if this living arrangement is going to work. Trey and I need the master suite. Obviously, we are the young couple building a future. You do not need all this space. It is ridiculous for one old man to take up the best room in the house with his dusty old things." She kicked a bag of my clothes toward the top of the basement stairs. The door to the basement was open, revealing the dark wooden steps leading down into the gloom. "You are moving downstairs," she declared. "It is better for everyone. It is cooler down there in the summer, and you won't have to worry about climbing the stairs with your bad knees. Plus, it keeps you out of our way." I looked at the bag teetering on the edge of the stairs. Inside were my Sunday suits, the shirts I had ironed myself for church, the tie I wore to my wife's funeral. "You are putting me in the cellar," I stated, my voice calm and level. "It is a finished basement." "Silas, do not be dramatic," she snapped. "It has a concrete floor and a window. It is fine. Go on, take your stuff down." She gave the bag a final shove with her slippered foot. I watched it tumble down the stairs, hitting every step with a dull thump until it landed on the concrete floor below. The zipper burst open, spilling my white dress shirts onto the dusty ground. I looked at my son. Trey was standing in the doorway of the bedroom holding a framed photo of me and his mother. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was staring at the floor, his shoulders hunched in that familiar posture of submission he adopted whenever Paige was in the room. "Trey," I said, "are you going to say anything?" This was his house, legally speaking, only in his mind. I had let them believe I would transfer the deed to him as a wedding gift. I had let them believe the paperwork was already in motion, but currently his name wasn't on anything but a lease for a car I paid for. Trey finally looked up. His eyes were pleading, begging me not to make a scene, begging me to just go along with it so his life would be easier. "Dad, look," he started, his voice wavering. "It makes sense. Paige has allergies. She is really sensitive to smells. And you know you always have that scent on you." "That scent," I repeated. "Yeah," Trey said, gaining a little more confidence now that he had an excuse. "That industrial smell. Grease, oil, metal. It gets into the fabrics, Dad. It is hard to get out. Paige just wants everything to be fresh. The basement is private. You will have your own space. It is really for the best." I looked at my hands. They were clean. I scrubbed them every night with pumice soap. I hadn't worked a shift in the mechanic shop in 5 years ever since I transitioned fully to managing Mercer Equity. But to them the smell wasn't physical. It was a stain on their social status. To Trey, I smelled like the poverty he was running from. I smelled like the hard labor that paid for his private school tuition and his college degree. I smelled like the sacrifice he was ashamed of. I walked over to him. I stood close enough that he had to look me in the face. I saw the fear in his eyes, the knowledge that he was betraying the man who had been his father and mother for most of his life. "The smell of oil," I said quietly, so only he could hear. "That smell paid for the suit you got married in. That smell paid for this house. That smell put food in your stomach when you were too little to hold a spoon. And now it offends you." Trey flinched. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to make another excuse, but Paige cut him off. "Oh, stop the guilt trip, Silas," she yelled from the hallway. "We are doing you a favor letting you stay here at all. Most people would have put you in a home by now. You are lucky we are family. Now go downstairs and get settled. We have guests coming at 6, and I do not want to see any of your junk in the hallway." She grabbed the photo frame from Trey's hands, the picture of me and my late wife laughing on a beach, and tossed it onto the pile of bags destined for the darkness. The glass didn't break, but the disrespect shattered whatever hope I had left for them. I didn't say another word. Arguing with them was like trying to explain calculus to a goldfish. They lacked the capacity to understand who I was or what they were doing. I walked past them, my heavy boots echoing on the hardwood floor. I walked to the top of the basement stairs and looked down into the shadows. "Fine," I said. "I will stay out of your way." I descended the stairs, picking up the bag of shirts Paige had kicked down. The basement air was cool and smelled of damp earth and neglect. It was a stark contrast to the climate-controlled comfort of the upper floors. There was a small cot in the corner that I used for naps when I was working on projects down here years ago. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling. I heard the door at the top of the stairs slam shut, followed by the sound of a lock clicking. They were locking me in. Not literally the lock was on my side, but symbolically they were sealing me away from their perfect life. I listened to their footsteps above my head. I heard Paige laughing a sharp, triumphant sound. I heard the clinking of dishes. They were probably making breakfast in my kitchen, eating off my plates, celebrating their victory over the old man. I set the bag of clothes on the cot. I didn't unpack. I didn't plan on staying in this cellar long enough to need a change of clothes. I wasn't here to live. I was here to work. I walked to the far corner of the basement behind the furnace where an old workbench stood covered in cobwebs. This was where I used to tinker with engines, where I taught Trey how to hold a wrench back when he still looked at me with adoration instead of shame. I pushed the heavy workbench aside. The concrete floor beneath it looked solid, indistinguishable from the rest of the foundation. I knelt down and brushed away a layer of dust, revealing a small, nearly invisible seam in the concrete. I pulled a small pry bar from my pocket and wedged it into the crack. With a grunt of effort, I lifted a square section of the floor. It was a false panel I had installed 10 years ago, a hiding place for things that were too important for a bank deposit box. Underneath the panel sat a fireproof steel safe. I spun the dial, left to 24, right to 10, left to 56. The dates of my wife's birth and death, the tumblers clicked into place with a satisfying sound of precision. I pulled the heavy door open. Inside, stacked neatly in waterproof envelopes, was the true foundation of this house. I bypassed the stacks of emergency cash. I bypassed the gold coins. I reached for a blue folder at the very bottom. I opened it and pulled out the documents. The first was the deed to the house. My name, Silas Mercer, was the only one on it. There was no transfer pending. There was no joint ownership. They were living in my house, sleeping in my room solely at my pleasure. Beneath the deed was a thicker file. The incorporation papers for Mercer Equity, the list of subsidiaries, and the acquisition documents for Vanguard Tech finalized and signed just last week. I sat on the cold concrete floor holding the papers in my rough hands. Upstairs, they thought they had thrown a piece of trash into the basement. They thought they had discarded a useless old man who smelled like grease. They didn't know they had just locked themselves in a cage with a lion. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed Aria. The signal was weak down here, but it connected. "Aria," I said, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. "It is Silas. I am ready," she answered instantly. She was always ready. "Do not transfer the house," I said. "Keep the title in my name." And Aria, "Yes, Silas. Cancel the credit cards, all of them. The ones Trey has, the ones Paige has, the emergency cards, everything. Mark them as stolen." There was a pause on the line, then I could hear the smile in her voice. "Consider it done." "Anything else?" "Yes," I said, looking up at the ceiling where I could hear the muffled sounds of Paige's high heels clicking across the floor. "Send a notice to Richard Sterling at Vanguard Tech. Tell him the new CEO will be conducting a surprise inspection of the regional office on Monday morning. Tell him to have all the financial records ready." I hung up the phone and placed it on the workbench. I looked at the deed in my hand one last time before placing it back in the safe. I locked it and slid the false floor panel back into place. I pushed the workbench back, covering my tracks. I sat on the edge of the cot and waited. I waited for the screams that I knew would come when they tried to pay for their housewarming party catering. I waited for the panic. The basement was cold, but my blood was running hot. They wanted the old mechanic. They were about to find out that the mechanic knows exactly how to take the whole engine apart piece by piece. A week had passed since my exile to the basement began, and the ecosystem of the house had shifted entirely. I was no longer the owner. I was the ghost that haunted the laundry room. I spent my days outside tending to the lawn that I paid a landscaping crew to manage just last month. It was part of the charade. If they wanted me to be the help, then I would play the part until the curtain fell. It was 6 p.m. when a silver Mercedes S-Class sedan turned into the driveway. The engine purred with that specific German engineering hum that screams money. It was brand new. The temporary tags were still in the window. I knew exactly how much that car cost. $130,000. I also knew Richard Sterling's salary as a regional director at Vanguard Tech was $150,000 a year before taxes. The math didn't work, unless you factored in the audit report Aria had sent me that morning. The report detailed a series of suspicious invoices for IT consulting fees paid to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. Richard stepped out of the car wearing a navy blue suit that looked tailored but fit him poorly around the middle. He slammed the door shut with a heavy thud and patted the roof of the car affectionately. His wife Veronica climbed out of the passenger side looking like she had smelled something rotten. She probably had. It was the stench of her husband's desperation masked by new leather smell. I was on my knees weeding the flower bed near the porch. Richard didn't even look down at me. He looked over my head toward the front door where Paige and Trey were waiting. "Look at this beauty," Richard boomed, his voice carrying across the lawn. "Top of the line, heated seats, massage function. It drives itself practically." I figured the future vice president of Vanguard Tech needed a ride that matched the title. Paige squealed and ran to hug him. "Daddy, it is gorgeous. You finally got it." I stood up, wiping the dirt from my hands onto my work pants. Richard's eyes finally flicked toward me. He didn't see Silas Mercer, the homeowner. He saw a gardener. He saw a nuisance. "Hey, Silas," he said, tossing his keys through the air. "Catch." I didn't move. The keys hit my chest and fell into the dirt. Richard laughed, a short barking sound. "Reflexes are going, huh? Park it in the garage for me. And wash it. It got a little dusty on the highway. Be careful with the paint. It costs more than you made in a decade." He walked past me up the steps and into the house my money had built. Trey looked at me. For a second, I saw shame in his eyes. He knew I wasn't a valet. He knew I paid the mortgage. But he said nothing. He just turned and followed the money. I picked up the keys. I didn't park the car. I left it right there in the driveway, blocking the entrance. I walked around the back of the house and entered through the kitchen door. The smell of roast beef filled the air. Paige had ordered catering. She didn't cook. Dinner was a masterclass in humiliation. They sat at the dining table under the crystal chandelier I had installed for my late wife. I wasn't seated at the table. Paige had set a small folding table in the corner near the kitchen door. It was the kind of table you put kids at during Thanksgiving. Or the help. I sat there in silence, eating the dry ends of the roast beef while they feasted on the prime cuts. But I wasn't just eating. I was listening. I was gathering ammunition. Richard was on his third glass of wine. It was a vintage Cabernet from my private cellar, a bottle I had been saving for my retirement. Paige had raided the wine rack without asking. "You know," Richard said, leaning back in his chair and swirling the wine, "things are about to change big time at Vanguard. We got acquired last week. Some private equity firm called Mercer Equity." I didn't react. I kept chewing my dry meat. "Nobody knows who runs it," Richard continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But the rumor is the new CEO is some diversity hire, a black guy from Chicago or something. Probably never ran a lemonade stand in his life. Just a figurehead put there by the board to meet some quota." Veronica gasped. "Oh, Richard, that is terrible. Is he going to ruin the company?" "He won't get the chance," Richard scoffed. "I have a meeting with him tomorrow morning. I am going to walk into that boardroom and show him who really runs the show. These guys, they come in with their affirmative action degrees and think they know business. They don't know the first thing about tech. I give him 6 months before he is out and I am running the whole show. I might even buy the company myself once he drives the stock price down." I took a sip of water. It took every ounce of my self-control not to laugh. Richard Sterling thought he could buy a company valued at $400 million. The man was living on credit cards and stolen funds. He was delusional. Trey chimed in, eager to please his father-in-law. "You show him, Richard. You built that regional office. They can't just push you aside for some nobody. Some nobody. My own son was cheering for the man who was insulting his father's race and his father's competence without even knowing it." Richard banged his fist on the table, rattling the silverware. "Exactly. It is about respect. It is about hierarchy. People need to know their place." Speaking of which, he turned in his chair and looked at me. "Hey, old-timer, we are dry over here. How about you earn your keep and top us off?" Paige giggled. "Yeah, Silas. Make yourself useful. Being a house guest isn't free." I stood up. I walked over to the sideboard and picked up the bottle of Cabernet. It was heavy in my hand, a weapon if I wanted it to be. But I had a different kind of violence in mind. I walked around the table. I filled Veronica's glass. I filled Trey's glass. I filled Paige's glass. Then I stood next to Richard. He didn't even look up. He was busy picking his teeth with a fingernail. I tilted the bottle. The dark red liquid poured into his glass. I watched the level rise. It reached the rim. I didn't stop. The wine overflowed. It cascaded down the side of the glass. It pooled on the white tablecloth. It dripped onto Richard's lap. It soaked into his navy blue suit pants. "Hey!" he shouted, jumping up and knocking his chair back. "What the hell are you doing, you senile idiot?" He looked at his pants. The red stain was spreading rapidly. "This is a $3,000 suit," he roared. "You clumsy, stupid old man." I put the bottle down on the table with a calm thud. "My hand slipped," I said. My voice was flat, monotone. "Just like my reflexes, right, Richard?" Richard's face turned a violent shade of purple. He raised his hand. For a second I thought he was going to strike me. I almost hoped he would. I still had the muscle memory of a man who worked with steel for 40 years. If he touched me, I would put him through the drywall. Trey jumped up and grabbed Richard's arm. "Richard, don't. He is old. He doesn't know what he is doing." "He ruined my suit," Richard spat, shaking Trey off. "Look at him. He is staring at me. He did it on purpose." Paige was on her feet now, too, rushing to blot Richard's pants with a napkin. "This is unacceptable," she hissed at me. "You have ruined dinner. You have ruined everything since we got here." I looked at them, the panic in Trey's eyes, the rage in Richard's, the pure malice in Paige's. They were a pack of wolves turning on a wounded animal, but they didn't realize the animal wasn't wounded. It was just waiting. Richard pushed Paige away. "Get away. It is ruined." He leaned across the table, his face inches from mine. I could smell the alcohol on his breath. I could see the broken veins in his nose. "Listen to me, you useless drain on society," Richard growled. "I am going to be the vice president of a billion-dollar company tomorrow. I am going to have power you can't even dream of. And the first thing I am going to do with my bonus is buy this house from your son." He looked at Trey. "We are buying it, Trey. And once my name is on the deed, this man goes." He pointed a shaking finger at my face. "We are putting you in a home, Silas. The cheapest, most state-funded, rat-infested nursing home I can find. A place where you can rot in a room with 3 other people who drool on themselves. You are done living off my daughter's charity. You are done ruining my suits. You are going to be locked away where nobody has to look at you ever again." The room went silent. The threat hung in the air. A nursing home, a prison for the unwanted. Paige nodded slowly. "Dad is right, Trey. We can't handle him anymore. He is dangerous. Look at him. He is looking at us like he wants to kill us. He needs professional supervision." Trey looked at me. He looked at the wine stain. He looked at his wife. Maybe, Trey whispered, maybe it is time. That broke the final chain. My son was agreeing to lock me away. He was agreeing to erase me. I looked Richard in the eye. I didn't blink. "You are going to be vice president?" I asked. "Damn right I am," Richard sneered. "And you are going to be a number on a patient chart." I picked up my napkin from the small folding table. I wiped my hands. "We will see who ends up with a number, Richard," I said. I turned and walked toward the basement door. "Where are you going?" Paige shouted. "You aren't going to clean this up." I opened the door to the cellar. "No," I said. "I am going to sleep. I have a big day tomorrow." I closed the door behind me and locked it. I descended the stairs into the cool darkness. My heart wasn't racing, my hands weren't shaking. I felt a cold clarity settling over me. They wanted to play power games. They wanted to talk about hierarchy. They wanted to threaten my freedom. I walked to the workbench and moved it aside. I opened the safe. I took out the file marked Vanguard Tech. I pulled out the personnel dossier on Richard Sterling. I flipped to the page listing his contract details and his severance clauses. I took a red marker from the workbench. I drew a thick line through the word severance. Then I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. I wrote down a list of names, the board of directors, the HR head, the legal team. I dialed Arya. "It is time," I said when she answered. "Is everything okay, Silas?" "No," I said. "They threatened to put me in a home. They are planning to declare me incompetent." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "That is a declaration of war, Silas." "Yes," I said. "And tomorrow morning I am dropping the bomb. I want you to meet me at the Vanguard Tech headquarters at 8 a.m. Bring the termination papers. Bring the forensic accounting team. And Arya, yes, bring the police. I have a feeling Richard Sterling is going to have a very bad reaction to his performance review." I hung up the phone. I sat on the cot in the darkness listening to them clean up the wine upstairs. They were scrubbing the floor. Tomorrow I would scrub the whole company. Richard wanted to see the new black CEO. He was going to get a front row seat, and he wasn't going to like the view. The basement air was always damp, but that afternoon it felt particularly suffocating. I sat at my makeshift desk, a slab of wood resting on two sawhorses surrounded by the hum of the furnace and the faint scent of mildew. To the naked eye, I was just an old man tinkering with a broken toaster. But beneath a pile of oily rags sat my laptop, the screen glowing with a live audio feed from the living room upstairs. I had installed the listening devices 3 years ago, not out of paranoia, but out of habit. When you build an empire from nothing, you learn that information is the only currency that never devalues. I adjusted the headphones over my ears. The sound was crystal clear. It was Paige. She was pacing. I could hear the sharp click of her heels on the hardwood floor I had paid to refinish last summer. She was on the phone, her voice lowered to a conspiratorial whisper, but the high-end microphone picked up every syllable. "Doctor, I do not care about the ethical guidelines," Paige hissed. "We are running out of time. He is becoming aggressive. Yesterday he threw a bottle of wine at my father. He is delusional. He thinks he owns the place." I sat perfectly still. The lie was so bold it almost impressed me. I hadn't thrown the bottle. I had poured it. There was a difference. One was an act of loss of control. The other was a deliberate act of war. I heard a male voice on the other end of the line. The connection was clear enough for me to identify the tone of a man who was negotiating, not diagnosing. It was Dr. Evans, a man known in certain circles for his flexibility regarding the truth provided the price was right. "I understand your concern," Mrs. Mercer Evans said, his voice oily and smooth. "But involuntary commitment requires substantial evidence. A judge needs to see a pattern of decline, danger to self or others. Creating that paper trail takes time." "We do not have time," Paige snapped. "My father is taking over Vanguard Tech tomorrow. We need the old man out of the house and declared incompetent before he ruins anything else. I need a signature doctor. I need a medical affidavit stating that Silas Mercer is suffering from advanced dementia and requires immediate, secure custodial care. How much?" There was a pause on the line, the silence of a predator calculating the weight of its prey. "For an expedited evaluation without an in-person assessment," Evans said slowly. "That puts my license at considerable risk. It would require a significant retainer. $20,000. Cash. $20,000. The price of my freedom. The price of my life." Fine, Paige said without hesitation. "I will have the cash by Friday. Just get the papers ready. I want him in a facility by the weekend, somewhere far away. I do not want him wandering back here." She hung up. I heard her let out a long breath followed by a laugh. It was a cold, hollow sound. She was celebrating. She thought she had won. She thought she had just bought the key to her future. I reached out and pressed the save button on the recording interface. The file was named Evidence Conspiracy 004. I added it to the folder that was already bursting with proof of their treachery. I took the headphones off and stared at the concrete wall. The dampness of the basement suddenly felt like a different kind of cold. It felt like a hospital room. It felt like a memory I had spent 20 years trying to bury. I closed my eyes and I was back in Chicago. It was raining. It was always raining in my nightmares. I was standing next to a hospital bed holding the hand of my wife Beatrice. She was only 50. She should have had decades left. But we had been poor then. We had been ignorant of how the world really worked. Beatrice had gotten sick. It started small confusion, fatigue. We went to a doctor a man recommended by the state clinic because we didn't have insurance. He told us it was nothing. He told us she was just tired. He gave her pills that made her foggy, that made her pliable. Then a social worker showed up. She said there were reports that I couldn't take care of her, that I was neglecting her. They were lies spun by a landlord who wanted us out of his rent-controlled apartment so he could renovate. The landlord knew the doctor. The doctor knew the social worker. It was a web of small-town corruption designed to crush people who didn't have the voice to scream. They took her. They got a court order signed by a judge who didn't even look at the file. They declared her incompetent and me unfit. They moved her to a state facility 3 hours away, a warehouse for the unwanted. I fought them. I sold my tools. I sold my truck. I spent every dime I had on lawyers who took my money and did nothing. I worked double shifts, sleeping in bus stations, trying to get her back. But the system was a machine, and we were just grist for the mill. By the time I gathered enough evidence to prove the doctor was a fraud, it was too late. The facility had neglected a simple infection. Beatrice died alone in a room with peeling paint and the smell of urine calling my name. I didn't get to say goodbye. I only got to identify her body. I stood over her casket, and I made a promise. I promised her that I would never be powerless again. I promised her that I would learn their game. I would learn their rules, and then I would break them. That was the day the mechanic died and the businessman was born. I poured my grief into rage and my rage into ambition. I learned finance. I learned law. I built Mercer Equity on the ashes of my own heart. I destroyed the landlord who evicted us. I bought the building he owned, and I evicted him. I sued the doctor until he lost his license and his home. But I never told Trey. I wanted to protect him from the darkness of that world. I wanted him to grow up innocent. I wanted him to believe that hard work and kindness were enough. I opened my eyes. The concrete wall was still there. The furnace was still humming. But the sadness was gone. It had been replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I had failed Beatrice because I was weak. I would not fail myself. And I would not let them do to me what they did to her. Paige and Trey weren't just greedy children. They were the embodiment of the system that had killed my wife. They were the people who thought human beings were disposable commodities. I wasn't just fighting for my house or my money anymore. I was fighting for Beatrice. I picked up my phone. I didn't tremble. My fingers were steady as stone. I dialed Aria. "It is done," I said when she answered. "Did you get it?" she asked. "I got it all," I replied. "Conspiracy to commit medical fraud, solicitation of a false diagnosis, intent to kidnap." "It is all recorded." "Good," Aria said. "I will have the affidavit ready for the police. Do you want to move now?" "Not yet," I said. "I want them to feel safe. I want them to spend that money they think they have. But Aria, we are accelerating the timeline." I stood up and walked to the safe hidden in the floor. I needed to look at the papers again. I needed to see the numbers. "Activate clean sweep," I commanded. There was a pause on the line. Aria knew what that meant. It was the nuclear option. It was the strategy we had designed for hostile corporate takeovers, adapted for a domestic war. "Are you sure, Silas?" she asked. "Clean sweep means total scorched earth. We buy everything. We call in every note immediately. It will destroy their credit scores, their assets, their ability to rent a car or buy a pack of gum. It is financial execution." I looked at the ceiling. I could hear Paige walking around upstairs. She was probably looking for her purse, getting ready to go out and celebrate her impending victory. She was planning to spend $20,000 to lock me in a cage. "They want to put me in a home, Aria," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "They want to declare me dead while I am still breathing." "I understand," Aria said, her voice turning crisp and professional. "I will contact the banks. We will buy the note on Trey's car. We will buy the debt on Paige's student loans. We will purchase the outstanding balance on every credit card they have. By tomorrow morning, you will be their only creditor. And the house I asked, the house is yours, Silas, it always has been. But I will file the eviction notice with the court tomorrow morning. It will be served within 48 hours. "Good," I said. And Aria, "Yes, make sure the purchase of Vanguard Tech is public knowledge by 9 a.m. tomorrow. I want Richard Sterling to walk into that office thinking he is a king, only to find out he is trespassing on my property." "Understood," she said. "Stay safe, Silas. Do not let them provoke you." "I won't," I said. I hung up the phone. I felt a strange sense of calm. The machinery was in motion. The gears were turning. They thought they were dealing with a senile old man who could be bullied into submission. They thought they could pay a corrupt doctor to erase my existence. They forgot one thing. I was the one who fixed things. I was the one who understood how the machine worked. And I knew exactly which bolt to remove to make the whole thing collapse. I walked over to the small mirror I had hung over the utility sink. I looked at my reflection. The gray hair, the lined face, the eyes that had seen too much. I didn't see a victim. I saw a man who was about to teach a very expensive lesson. I washed my face with cold water. I dried it with a rough towel. Then I sat back down at my desk and opened the file marked Richard Sterling. I had one more night in the basement. One more night of being the pig. Tomorrow I would be the butcher. The sun rose on Friday morning with a brightness that seemed to mock the darkness of my reality. From the small basement window, I watched the tires of my own SUV crunch over the gravel driveway. It was Trey and Paige. They were leaving the house early, dressed in what they considered power outfits. Paige wore oversized sunglasses and a scarf that cost more than my first set of tools. Trey was in a polo shirt, trying to look like the country club member he desperately wanted to be. They looked like a couple without a care in the world. They looked like people who had won. I knew exactly where they were going. They were heading to the bank. They needed $20,000 in cash to pay Dr. Evans for the fraudulent medical report that would strip me of my freedom. They were going to use my money to buy the chains they intended to put on me. The irony was so thick, I could taste it like copper in my mouth. I sat on the edge of my cot and checked my watch. It was 9:15 in the morning. Arya had executed the clean sweep protocol at exactly 9 o'clock. The digital signals had already been sent. The servers at the bank had updated. The trap was set and the bait had been taken. I wasn't in the basement anymore, at least not in spirit. Physically I was there, but my mind was miles away. I had told them I was going fishing. It was the perfect excuse. It played into their image of me as a simple retiree wasting his days by the water. I had walked out the back door with my tackle box and a rod trudging toward the marina. But I didn't get on a dinghy. I boarded the Obsidian. She was a 60-foot yacht docked in a private slip registered under a shell corporation. She was my mobile office, my sanctuary. I sat on the aft deck, the ocean breeze cooling the rage that still simmered in my gut. I had a tablet in front of me displaying the real-time status of every account linked to my social security number. I watched the screen waiting for the notification. Meanwhile, across town, Trey and Paige were walking into the First National Bank branch. I could envision it perfectly. They would bypass the line for the regular tellers. Trey liked to go to the priority window, the one reserved for high-value clients. He enjoyed the feeling of importance it gave him, even though the money in the account was entirely mine. They approached the counter. The teller, a woman named Sarah, whom I had known for years, would smile at them. She was professional. She didn't know that the young man in front of her was planning to commit his father. "I need a cashier's check for $20,000, Trey would say, sliding the platinum debit card across the marble counter. "And I need to withdraw another $5,000 in cash for spending money for the weekend." Paige would be standing next to him, tapping on her phone, probably browsing for new furniture for the living room she planned to redecorate once I was gone. She wouldn't even look at the teller. To her, the bank staff were just vending machines with pulses. Sarah would take the card. She would swipe it through the reader. She would type in the amount. And then the silence would begin. I watched the alert pop up on my tablet screen. Transaction attempted. Location First National Bank. Amount $25,000. Status declined. Code 04. Pickup card. The first domino had fallen. Back at the bank, the cheerful beep of the card reader was replaced by a harsh, low tone. Sarah frowned. She would look at the screen, then at the card, then back at the screen. She would type something on her keyboard, trying to override what she assumed was a glitch. "Is there a problem?" Trey would ask, his voice tinged with impatience. "We are in a hurry." One moment Sir Sarah would say, her voice losing its warmth. She would type again. The result would be the same. The system was locked down tight. Arya had done her job. The accounts were frozen. The credit lines were revoked. The joint access Trey had enjoyed for a decade had been terminated exactly 15 minutes ago. "Sir, the system is declining the transaction," Sarah would say. "Try it again," Paige would snap, looking up from her phone. "It is a platinum card. It does not get declined." Sarah would try again, but this time the machine would do something different. It wouldn't just beep. It would whir softly and keep the card. It wouldn't spit it back out. "Hey," Trey would shout. "That is my card. Give it back. I cannot do that." Sir Sarah would reply, taking a step back from the counter. "The system has flagged this card as lost or stolen. I am required to retain it." "Stolen," Trey would yell, his face turning red. "I am Trey Mercer. That is my father's account. I have full authorization." "Check the file." "I am checking the file, sir," Sarah would say, her eyes scanning the notes on her screen. "The authorization was revoked this morning by the account holder. Mr. Silas Mercer has reported all cards in his household as compromised." Compromised, Paige would screech. "This is ridiculous. Call him. Call the old man right now. He probably pressed the wrong button on his phone or something. He is senile. We cannot contact the account holder for you, ma'am." Sarah would say, her hand reaching for the silent alarm button under the desk, just in case. "And I cannot give you any funds. The current available balance in this account is 0. "Zero," Trey would whisper, the color draining from his face. "That is impossible. There was over $200,000 in there yesterday." "It has been transferred," Sarah would state, "to a secure account." The humiliation was public now. The other customers in the bank were staring. The security guard near the door took a step forward, his hand resting on his belt. Trey and Paige, the golden couple, were standing at the counter. broke and accused of theft. We are not leaving until we get our money, Paige would yell, slamming her designer handbag onto the counter. Do you know who my father is? He is the vice president of Vanguard Tech. You are making a huge mistake. Ma'am, if you do not lower your voice, I will have to ask you to leave, the guard would say, stepping in. Trey grabbed his phone. His hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped it. He dialed my number. On the deck of the Obsidian, my phone began to ring. The screen flashed with the picture of Trey, a photo from his college graduation where he looked happy and proud. That boy was gone. The man calling me now was a stranger. I picked up the phone. I didn't say hello. I didn't stammer. I didn't use the weak, trembling voice I had adopted to make them feel superior. What I said, the word was a stone dropped into a deep well. Dad, what the hell is going on? Trey screamed into the receiver. We are at the bank. They took the card. They say the money is gone. Fix it. Fix it right now. I took a sip of my iced tea. I looked out at the horizon where the blue sky met the blue water. There is nothing to fix, Trey, I said, calm and cold. What are you talking about? He shouted. The teller says you reported the card stolen. Tell them it is a mistake. Tell them to give me the money. We need it. You don't need it, I said. You want it, and you are not getting it. Dad, stop playing games, he pleaded, his voice cracking. This is embarrassing. People are looking at us. Just authorize the transaction. No, I said. The silence on the line was heavy. No, Trey repeated as if he didn't understand the word. But it is our money. It is my money, I corrected him. It has always been my money. Every cent. The car you drive, the clothes you wear, the food you eat. It was all a gift, and you have proven you are unworthy of it. Paige snatched the phone from Trey. I could hear the rustle of the movement. Listen to me, you old fool, she hissed. I don't know what kind of tantrum you are throwing, but you need to stop it. We have expenses. We have plans. If you don't unlock this account right now, I swear to God I will leave you in that basement until you rot. I will have the doctors come today. I will have you committed before dinner. I laughed. It was a dry, dark sound. You can't pay the doctors, Paige, I said. You don't have $20,000. You don't even have $20. She gasped. How did you? I know everything, I said, my voice dropping an octave. I know about the doctor. I know about the price. I know about your plan to declare me incompetent. I heard every word. The line went dead silent. The panic was setting in. You were spying on us, she whispered. I was protecting myself, I said. And now, I am finishing it. Silas. Please, Trey said, having taken the phone back. We are stranded here. The car is low on gas. We haven't eaten lunch. Then walk, I said. Walk, he stammered. It is 5 miles to the house. It will do you good, I said. You can think about what you have done. And Trey. Yes, Dad. Don't bother going back to the house. The locks are being changed as we speak. Your bags are on the front lawn. I suggest you grab them before it rains. Dad. You can't do this, he cried. We have nowhere to go. Go to Richard, I said. Go to the big, important vice president. Let him take care of you. Oh, wait, he hasn't started his new job yet, has he? I didn't wait for an answer. I ended the call. I placed the phone down on the table next to my tablet. I could imagine the scene at the bank, the realization crashing down on them, the security guard escorting them out, the long, hot walk back to a house they could no longer enter. They had gone to the bank to buy my imprisonment. Instead, they had just cashed a check for their own destruction. I stood up and walked to the railing of the yacht. The water was calm. The air was fresh. I felt lighter than I had in years. The first strike had landed. They were broke. They were homeless. They were exposed. But I wasn't done. The financial ruin was just the opening move. Tomorrow was Monday. Tomorrow Richard Sterling was going to walk into Vanguard Tech expecting a coronation. I checked the time. Arya would be finalizing the paperwork for the hostile takeover announcement. I needed to pick out a suit, not the cheap gray one I wore to the wedding. I needed something sharp, something intimidating, something that said CEO. I went below deck to the master cabin. My wardrobe was there, the clothes of Silas Mercer, the businessman, not Silas the mechanic. I ran my hand over the fabric of a bespoke Navy suit. They wanted a boss. They were going to get one, I smiled. The bank was just a skirmish. The war for the company and for my dignity was about to be won in the boardroom. And unlike Trey, I didn't need a credit card to prove my worth. I had the deed to the whole damn world. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the horizon when Paige arrived at her father's estate. She didn't drive her luxury SUV because Arya had already sent the repossession team to collect it from the bank parking lot. She arrived in a rideshare, her face streaked with mascara, looking like a beauty queen who had lost her crown. I knew this because I had access to the security feed at Richard's gate. I had bought the security firm that monitored his neighborhood 6 months ago. It was a small investment that was paying big dividends today. I watched on my tablet as Paige stormed into her father's study. Richard was pouring himself a drink, probably celebrating the job he thought he was getting tomorrow. He didn't look like a man on the brink of ruin. He looked like a man who believed the world owed him everything. "Daddy, you have to help us," Paige screamed, throwing herself onto the leather sofa. "The old man has gone crazy. He froze our accounts. He reported the cards stolen. We are stranded. We have nothing." Richard frowned, swirling the scotch in his glass. "What are you talking about? Silas is a mechanic. He barely knows how to use a smartphone. How could he freeze your accounts?" "He is vindictive," Paige sobbed. "He found out about the nursing home plan. He must have overheard me talking to Dr. Evans. Now he is claiming we stole from him. He kicked us out of the house, Daddy. He put our bags on the lawn like we are trash." Richard's face turned a deep shade of crimson. He slammed his glass down on the mahogany desk. The liquid sloshed over the rim, staining the wood. "He kicked you out," Richard roared. "That house belongs to Trey. I saw the way you two lived. There is no way that old grease monkey owns a property like that. He says the deed is in his name," Paige cried. "And the bank believed him. They cut us off. You have to do something. You have to fix this." Richard picked up his phone. He didn't call a lawyer. He didn't call the bank. He dialed a number from memory, a number that I knew belonged to a corrupt detective in the local precinct named Miller. Miller was the kind of cop who made problems disappear for the right price. "Miller it is, Sterling." Richard barked into the phone. "I have a situation. My daughter's father-in-law is becoming a threat. He is an old man, probably suffering from dementia, but he is erratic. He stole my daughter's credit cards and locked her out of her own home. I need you to pay him a visit. Scare him. Make him understand that if he doesn't unlock those accounts and open that door, he is going to spend his twilight years in a cell." I listened to the silence on the other end. Then Richard spoke again. "Yeah, tonight. Rough him up a little if you have to. Just get the job done. I want him compliant by tomorrow. I have a big day at Vanguard, and I do not want this distraction." He hung up the phone with a satisfied smirk. He walked over to Paige and patted her on the head as if she were a child. "Don't worry, Princess," Richard said. "Miller will handle it. Silas will be begging to let you back in by morning. And once I take over Vanguard tomorrow, I will have the resources to bury him legally. We will get that power of attorney. We will put him in the deepest hole the state system has to offer." I turned off the feed. Richard thought he had just ordered a hit. What he didn't know was that Miller was already under internal affairs investigation thanks to an anonymous tip I had sent weeks ago. If Miller tried to touch me, he would lose his badge before he could unholster his weapon. But the intent was clear. Richard Sterling wasn't just a thief. He was a thug in a suit. While Richard was plotting violence, his kingdom at Vanguard Tech was buzzing with a different kind of energy. The rumors of the acquisition had hit the office floor like a lightning strike. The internal memo I had sent out was vague but firm. It stated simply that the new chairman of the board and acting CEO would be arriving at 9 in the morning for a site inspection and leadership review. I switched my view to the cameras inside the Vanguard offices. It was chaos. Junior executives were running around with stacks of paper shredding documents that might look incriminating. The janitorial staff was polishing the floors until they looked like mirrors. Richard arrived at the office late in the evening, having left Paige at his home. He wanted to make sure everything was perfect for his coronation. He walked through the bullpen, barking orders at the few terrified assistants who had stayed late. "I want those quarterly reports on my desk," Richard shouted. "And get rid of that coffee stain in the conference room. The new boss is coming tomorrow. His name is S. Mercer." He paused, looking at the name on the memo he was holding. "Mercer," he muttered to himself. "Sounds British, or maybe old New England money. Probably some trust fund kid who inherited the holding company. I will wrap him around my finger in 10 minutes. He walked into his office and sat in his chair, spinning it around to look out the window at the city skyline. He put his feet up on the desk. "Vice President Sterling," he whispered to the reflection in the glass. "It has a nice ring to it. Maybe I will even be president once I show this Mercer kid how the real world works." He had no idea that S. Mercer stood for Silas Mercer. He had no idea that the man he had called a pig, the man he had just sent a dirty cop to assault, was the man who now owned the chair he was sitting in. He was preparing to manipulate a stranger, completely unaware that the stranger knew every secret he had tried to hide. He was printing out falsified expense reports, confident that no one would look too closely at the numbers. He was wrong. I had already looked. I had looked at everything. I closed the laptop and stood up. The sun had set over the marina. The water was black and still. It was time to prepare. I went to the closet in the master cabin of the yacht. I pushed aside the few casual clothes I kept there and reached for the garment bag in the back. I unzipped it slowly. Inside was a suit I had commissioned from a tailor in London 3 months ago. It was midnight blue, made of a wool and silk blend that cost more per yard than Richard's entire wardrobe. It was a suit of armor. I laid it out on the bed. Beside it I placed a crisp white shirt with French cuffs. I selected a pair of silver cufflinks, understated but heavy. I took out my watch. It wasn't a flashy gold Rolex like the one Richard wore to show off. It was a Patek Philippe Platinum with a leather strap. It was the kind of watch that didn't scream money. It whispered power. I went to the bathroom and lathered my face. I shaved slowly, carefully. I watched the razor glide over my skin, removing the stubble, removing the mask of the tired old man. I looked at my eyes in the mirror. They were the same eyes that had watched my wife die. They were the same eyes that had watched my son laugh at me. But tonight they were cold. They were clear. I was done hiding. I was done pretending to be slow. I was done affecting a stammer to make them feel comfortable. Tomorrow I would speak with my true voice. My phone buzzed. It was Aria. "Miller never showed up," she said. "Internal Affairs picked him up an hour ago. He tried to shake down a dealer on his way to your house. He is in custody." "Good," I said, wiping the remaining shaving cream from my face. "And Richard, he is still at the office," Aria replied. "He is rehearsing his speech. He thinks he is going to dazzle you." I smiled. It was a sharp, predatory smile. "Let him rehearse," I said. It is always tragic when an actor forgets his lines in the middle of the final act. I hung up and walked back to the bed. I ran my hand over the lapel of the suit. Tomorrow morning, I wouldn't take the truck. I would take the helicopter. I would land on the roof of the Vanguard building. I would descend from the sky like Judgment Day. Richard Sterling was worried about a coffee stain in the conference room. He should have been worried about the stain on his soul. He was preparing to welcome a stranger. He was preparing to trick a boss he didn't know. He had no idea that the boss was the man who had poured wine on his pants. He had no idea that the pig was coming to the slaughterhouse and he wasn't the one who was going to bleed. The transformation was complete. The mechanic was gone. The CEO was ready. And tomorrow, everyone would know his name. The morning sun reflected off the glass facade of the Vanguard Tech building, creating a blinding wall of light that seemed designed to keep the unworthy out. I adjusted my cuffs, feeling the heavy weight of the platinum cufflinks against my wrists. I was not driving the rusted pickup truck today. I had arrived in a black town car that dropped me off a block away because I wanted to walk the final 100 yards. I wanted to see my acquisition from the ground level. I wanted to see the rot before I cut it out. I pushed through the revolving doors and stepped into the lobby. It was a cavernous space of marble and chrome designed to intimidate. The air was frigid, pumped full of air conditioning that chilled the sweat on anyone who walked in off the street. I walked toward the security desk with the measured stride of a man who owned the concrete beneath his feet. My midnight blue suit absorbed the light, a stark contrast to the sterile white surroundings. The security guard did not look up as I approached. He was a young man with a thick neck and a bored expression scrolling through his phone. I cleared my throat. He swiped his finger across his screen one more time before slowly lifting his eyes. He didn't look at my face. He looked at my hands, then my suit, then my shoes, then my... Finally, he looked me in the eye. I saw the assessment happen in real time. He didn't see the bespoke tailoring. He didn't see the Patek Philippe watch. He saw an older black man in a lobby where the only people who looked like me were usually pushing a mop or delivering a package. "Deliveries are around the back, Pop," the guard said, returning his gaze to his phone. "I am not making a delivery," I said, my voice low and steady. "I am here for a meeting." The guard let out a heavy sigh as if my mere presence was exhausting him. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. "Look, old-timer, I do not have time for this. If you are here for the janitorial interviews, those are on Tuesday. If you are a driver looking for your client, wait in the car. The lobby is for employees and guests only. I placed my hand on the marble counter. It was cold. I am a guest, I stated. Name, he barked, not typing anything. Mercer, I said. He paused. The name meant nothing to him yet. It was just a sound. He didn't check the list. He didn't look at his computer. He just shook his head. I do not have a Mercer on the list. You need to leave before I call the actual security. Go on, scoot. I looked past him to the reception desk. 2 young women were whispering and giggling, ignoring the phones that were blinking with incoming calls. One of them filed her nails while the other applied lip gloss. This was the face of the company. This was the discipline Richard Sterling instilled. Disrespect, laziness, arrogance. I did not argue with the guard. I did not raise my voice. I simply stepped around the turnstile. Hey, the guard shouted, scrambling to his feet. You cannot go back there. Stop him. I kept walking. The sound of my shoes on the marble was a rhythmic drumbeat of war. I headed straight for the bank of elevators at the far end of the hall. There were 6 cars, but only one had a golden archway, the executive elevator, the one that led directly to the boardroom on the top floor. I pressed the call button. The light illuminated with a soft chime. I stood with my hands clasped behind my back, watching the numbers descend. The guard was rushing toward me now, his hand reaching for the radio on his belt. But before he could reach me, the elevator doors slid open with a smooth hiss. And there he was. Richard Sterling stood inside the elevator car. He was checking his reflection in the mirrored walls, smoothing his thinning hair. He wore a gray suit that was a shade too light for business formal and a tie that was aggressively red. He looked nervous. He was sweating. He was muttering to himself, rehearsing the lies he planned to tell the new chairman. When the doors opened, he looked up annoyed at the interruption. His eyes landed on me. For a second, there was no recognition, just the same dismissive glaze the guard had used. Then his eyes narrowed. He stepped forward, blocking the entrance to the car. What the hell are you doing here? Richard spat, his voice echoing in the lobby. I looked at him. I looked at the man who had eaten my food, drank my wine, and insulted my son in my own home. I looked at the man who had sent a dirty cop to beat me up less than 12 hours ago. I am going up, Richard, I said. Richard laughed. It was a sharp, incredulous sound. He stepped out of the elevator, planting his feet wide, physically barring my path. The security guard skidded to a halt behind me, breathless and ready to grab my arms. Hold on, Richard said, holding up a hand to stop the guard. I know this guy. This is the squatter, the moocher, my son-in-law's charity case. He leaned into my face. I could smell coffee and peppermint mouthwash masking the stale scent of last night's scotch. Did you follow me here, Silas? Richard hissed. Did you come to beg? Did Paige send you? I told her I would handle it. I told you I would handle it. You are lucky Miller didn't break your legs last night. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I have a meeting, I repeated. Richard's face turned a violent shade of red. He poked a finger into my chest right on the lapel of my jacket. You do not have a meeting. You have a death wish. This is a place of business, Silas. This is where the big boys play. This elevator. It is for executives. It is for people who matter. It is not for people like you. People like me, I asked quietly. Yeah, Richard sneered. People who smell like grease. People who live in basements. People who leech off their betters. Look at you. You put on a suit and think you can walk in here like you belong. You look ridiculous. You look like a chauffeur who stole his boss's clothes. He turned to the guard who was watching the exchange with a smirk. Get this trash out of my building, Richard ordered, and call the police. I want him trespassed. If he shows his face within 500 feet of this building again, I want him arrested. The guard stepped forward, grabbing my upper arm. His grip was tight, painful. Come on, Pops, the guard said. You heard Mr. Sterling. You are done. I looked at the guard's hand on my sleeve. Then I looked at Richard. He was smiling. It was the smile of a man who thought he had crushed an insect. This elevator is for the chairman, Richard said, adjusting his tie. And he is going to be here any minute. I do not want him seeing this mess. I do not want him smelling you. Get out. Use the stairs if you want to leave, or better yet, use the service elevator around the back with the rest of the garbage. He turned his back on me and stepped into the elevator. He pressed the button for the top floor. The doors began to close. Through the narrowing gap, I saw Richard checking his watch, shaking his head in disgust. I pulled my arm free from the guard's grip. I did it with a sharp, violent jerk that made the young man stumble back. I fixed him with a stare that stopped him cold. "Do not touch me again," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of absolute command. The guard froze. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. I turned away from the elevators. I saw the door to the stairwell. It was heavy steel painted a dull gray. I walked toward it. "Where are you going?" the guard called out, his voice wavering. "You have to leave." I ignored him. I pushed the door open. The stairwell was cold and smelled of concrete and dust. It was quiet. It was the only place in the building that felt honest. I began to climb. It was only 2 flights up to the executive conference room, but I took them slowly. 1 step, 2 steps. With each impact of my shoe on the concrete step, I felt the rage crystallizing into something sharper, something harder. Richard Sterling thought he had won. He thought he had banished me. He thought he had humiliated me. He had blocked the elevator because he believed he owned the vertical rise. He believed he was the gatekeeper. He didn't know that I owned the gate. I owned the elevator. I owned the building. I owned the ground he stood on. I climbed. My breath was steady. My heart was a slow, powerful drum. He told me to use the stairs. He wanted me to exert myself. He wanted me to feel the physical reminder of my age and my station. He wanted me to arrive sweaty and breathless if I arrived at all. But I wasn't sweating. I was freezing. The ice inside me was spreading. Step, step, step. I thought about the wedding, the pig comment. I thought about the basement, the garbage bags. I thought about the bank, the look on Trey's face. I reached the landing for the 2nd floor. I adjusted my tie in the reflection of the small window in the door. I smoothed the lapel where Richard's finger had poked me. He had called me trash. He had called me a leech. He had judged me by the color of my skin and the calluses on my hands. He had assumed that power looked like him. Loud. White. Arrogant. He was about to learn that power looks like silence. I put my hand on the door handle. On the other side of this door was the boardroom. On the other side was the entire board of directors. On the other side was Richard Sterling rehearsing his speech, waiting for a man named S. Mercer to walk through the main doors. He was expecting a stranger. He was expecting a handshake. He was expecting a promotion. I pushed the handle down. The latch clicked. He was going to get a ghost. I opened the door and stepped onto the plush carpet of the executive hallway. The air was different up here. It smelled of coffee and fear. I could hear Richard's voice booming from the conference room at the end of the hall. He was laughing. He was telling a joke. I walked toward the sound. I didn't rush. I was right on time. The pig had arrived at the slaughterhouse, and the butcher was holding the knife. The executive conference room at Vanguard Tech was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation, featuring a 30-foot table made of imported mahogany and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city skyline. I sat at the head of the table in the high-backed leather chair designated for the chairman. I had swiveled the chair around so that I was facing the glass, looking out at the city I had helped build with my own hands and my own capital. To anyone entering the room, all they would see was the back of the chair and the silhouette of a man in a dark suit. The other board members were already seated. I could feel their tension radiating through the room. They were silent. Arya had briefed them 10 minutes ago. They knew exactly who I was. They knew about the acquisition, and they knew they were to remain absolutely silent until I gave the signal. They were terrified. Good. Fear makes people listen. The heavy double doors at the far end of the room swung open. I heard the heavy, frantic footsteps of Richard Sterling. He was out of breath, probably from running up the 2 flights of stairs I had forced him to climb. He marched into the room with the bluster of a man trying to compensate for his lack of control. "Gentlemen," Richard boomed, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "My apologies for the delay. There was a security issue in the lobby. Some vagrant tried to force his way into the executive elevator. Can you believe the audacity? I had to handle it personally. You know how it is. You have to keep the riffraff out if you want to maintain standards." He paused, waiting for a laugh or a murmur of agreement from the board. There was only silence. The board members stared at their hands or at the polished table surface. None of them looked at Richard. Richard cleared his throat, the sound grating in the quiet room. He walked toward the head of the table, stopping a few feet behind my chair. He assumed I was the mysterious S. Mercer, the new owner. He needed to impress. He buttoned his jacket and smoothed his tie, preparing to deliver the performance of his life. Mr. Mercer Richard said, his voice taking on an oily, ingratiating tone. "It is an honor to finally welcome you to Vanguard Tech. I am Richard Sterling, the regional director. I have been running this ship through some very choppy waters, and I have big plans for our future. I know you are looking for strong leadership. I know you need someone who understands the landscape. I remained motionless, staring at the horizon. I didn't turn around. I didn't speak. I let him talk. I wanted him to dig the hole so deep he would never climb out. Richard took my silence as an invitation to continue. He began to pace behind me, his confidence growing with every lie he told. I have prepared a restructuring plan, Richard continued. We have a lot of dead weight in this company, Mr. Mercer, a lot of diversity hires and legacy employees who just do not have the hunger. I propose we cut 20% of the workforce immediately. We need to streamline. We need to get back to basics. I have already identified the departments we can gut. He was talking about firing the very people who actually did the work. The engineers, the support staff, the people like I used to be. He wanted to fire them to boost the stock price for a quarter, so he could get a bigger bonus. And honestly, Sir Richard said, stepping closer to my chair, leaning in as if we were co-conspirators. The previous leadership was weak. They lacked vision. They let the wrong element into the building. But under my guidance as vice president, or perhaps in a more elevated role, we can restore the prestige of this brand. I am a man who values excellence. I am a man who knows quality when he sees it. He paused for dramatic effect, waiting for the validation he was so desperate for. I know we will get along famously, Mr. Mercer, Richard said. We are cut from the same cloth, you and I. We are men of status. I smiled at my reflection in the window. It was time. I slowly raised my hand and placed it on the armrest of the chair. I gripped the leather tightly. Men of status. I said, my voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. Is that what we are, Richard? Richard froze. He recognized the voice. It wasn't the stammering, weak voice of his daughter's father-in-law. It was deep and commanding. But the timbre was familiar. Excuse me, Richard asked, confusion seeping into his tone. I pushed off the floor with my foot. The chair spun around slowly, smoothly. The high back revealed me inch by inch. First my polished shoes, then the sharp crease of my midnight blue trousers, then the platinum watch, and finally my face. I sat back looking up at him with cold, dead eyes. I didn't blink. I didn't smile. You said we are cut from the same cloth, I said. But yesterday you said I was cut from a different cloth. You said I was a pig. The color drained from Richard's face so fast it looked like his blood had evaporated. His mouth fell open. His eyes bulged. He staggered back a step as if he had been physically struck. Silas, he whispered. He looked around the room frantically, looking at the board members, looking for security, looking for an explanation that made sense in his twisted worldview. How did you get in here? Richard stammered, his voice rising in panic. Security. Where is security? Someone call the police. This man is trespassing. He is dangerous. The board members didn't move. They watched him with a mixture of pity and disgust. Sit down, Richard, I commanded. You do not tell me what to do, Richard screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. You are a mechanic. You are a squatter. You ruined my suit. Get out of that chair. That chair belongs to the owner of this company. I am the owner of this company, Richard. I said, my voice slicing through his hysteria like a razor. Richard laughed. It was a manic, terrified sound. You, he scoffed. You own a rusted truck and a tackle box. You do not own Vanguard Tech. This is a joke. Did Trey put you up to this? Is this some kind of sick prank? I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. Richard flinched, thinking I was reaching for a weapon. In a way, I was. I pulled out a folded document. It was the deed of sale for Vanguard Tech. It was signed, notarized, and stamped. I tossed it onto the table. It slid across the mahogany surface and stopped right in front of him. Read it, I said. Richard looked at the paper. He looked at me. His hands were shaking so bad he could barely pick it up. He lifted the document. His eyes scanned the lines. He saw the purchase price, $400 million. He saw the buyer, Mercer Equity. He saw the signature at the bottom, Silas Mercer, chairman and CEO. The paper slipped from his fingers and fluttered to the floor. Mercer, he whispered. S. Mercer. Silas Mercer. He looked up at me, and for the first time he really saw me. He didn't see the pig, he didn't see the charity case, he saw the predator that had been stalking him while he was busy admiring himself in the mirror. This is impossible, he breathed. You are nobody. I am the man who paid for your daughter's wedding, I said, standing up slowly. I am the man who paid off your son-in-law's debts. I am the man whose house you have been plotting to steal. And I am the man who just bought your life. Arya stepped out from the shadows in the corner of the room. She was holding a thick file. She walked to the table and placed it down with a heavy thud. Mr. Sterling. Arya said, her voice crisp and professional. I am Arya Vance, General Counsel for Mercer Equity. We have completed a forensic audit of your tenure as Regional Director. Richard looked at her, then back at me. The fight was draining out of him, replaced by pure terror. Audit, he squeaked. Yes, Arya continued, opening the file. We found some interesting discrepancies. Specifically, we found a series of invoices paid to a consulting firm called Sterling Solutions registered in the Cayman Islands. Over the last 5 years, you have authorized payments totaling $500,000 for services that were never rendered. Richard's knees gave out. He slumped into the nearest chair, gripping the edge of the table. That is a misunderstanding, he stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. That was legitimate work. Consulting. Strategy. We checked the IP addresses for the invoices, Arya said. They were generated from your home computer. We traced the bank transfers. The money went from Vanguard accounts directly to an offshore account in your name. That is embezzlement, Mr. Sterling. That is corporate fraud. That is grand larceny. Richard looked at me, his eyes pleading. Silas, listen to me, he begged. We are family. Paige is your daughter-in-law. We can work this out. I can pay it back. Just give me time. Do not do this. Think of the family. Family, I repeated, tasting the word. You told me last night that you were going to put me in a nursing home. You told me I was going to rot. You sent a dirty cop to my house to beat me into submission. Was that family, Richard? I was stressed. Richard cried. I didn't mean it. It was just talk. You meant every word I said, leaning over the table. You despise me. You despise my son even though you use him. You despise anyone you think is beneath you. You thought you were untouchable because you had a title and a suit. But the suit was bought with stolen money and the title just expired. I looked at the board members. This man does not represent the values of Mercer Equity, I stated. He is a thief, he is a bigot, and he is incompetent. I turned back to Richard. You are fired, Richard. For cause. Effective immediately. You will receive no severance. You will receive no pension. Your stock options are voided. Fired, Richard whispered, tears streaming down his face. You can't. I have a mortgage. I have the car. The car is company property, Arya interjected. We have already dispatched a team to tow it from the parking lot. And as for the mortgage, I said that is the least of your problems. I pressed a button on the intercom console on the table. Send them in, I said. The double doors opened again. 2 uniformed police officers walked in, followed by a detective in a cheap suit. It wasn't Miller. It was a detective from the Financial Crimes Division. Richard Sterling, the detective said, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. You are under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. Stand up and put your hands behind your back. Richard didn't stand up. He couldn't. He was paralyzed with fear. The officers had to hoist him out of the chair. He hung between them like a wet rag, his expensive suit bunching up around his shoulders. Silas, please, Richard screamed as they clicked the cuffs onto his wrists. Please don't let them take me. I am an old man. I can't go to jail. Help me. I walked around the table until I was standing right in front of him. I looked down at his tear-stained face. You wanted hierarchy, Richard, I said softly. You wanted people to know their place. I leaned in close so only he could hear. Your place is in a cell, and when you get there, remember the pig sent you. Take him away, I said to the officers. Richard began to sob loudly, an ugly guttural sound as they dragged him toward the door. He kicked and struggled his heels, leaving scuff marks on the polished floor. I am innocent, he wailed. This is a setup. He framed me. The door slammed shut, cutting off his screams. The room was silent again. The air felt cleaner. The board members were looking at me with a mixture of awe and apprehension. They had just watched a shark get eaten by a whale. I walked back to the head of the table. I sat down in the chairman's chair. I adjusted my cufflinks. I looked at the agenda in front of me. Now I said, addressing the room, my voice calm and businesslike. Let us discuss the future of Vanguard Tech. We have a lot of work to do to repair the damage that has been done. I felt a profound sense of satisfaction settle over me. It wasn't joy exactly. It was the feeling of a mechanic listening to an engine finally run smooth after removing a broken part. Richard was gone. The cancer had been cut out. I looked out the window at the city. Somewhere down there, Trey and Paige were walking along the side of a road, broke and homeless. Somewhere down there, Richard was being booked into a holding cell. I had destroyed their lives in 24 hours. But I hadn't done it with malice. I had done it with the truth. I had simply held up a mirror and forced them to look at themselves, and the reflection had shattered them. I turned my attention back to the spreadsheet in front of me. I had a company to run, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like hiding. I was Silas Mercer, and I was just getting started. The news hit Paige like a physical blow that knocked the wind out of her lungs. She was sitting on the concrete steps of my front porch, surrounded by her Louis Vuitton luggage, which was now damp from the morning mist. Trey was pacing back and forth on the dead grass, frantically trying to get a signal on his phone, which had likely been suspended for non-payment an hour ago. Paige's phone buzzed in her lap. It was her mother, Veronica. Paige snatched it up, hoping for a lifeline, hoping for a transfer of funds or a hotel reservation. Instead, she got a scream that sounded like a wounded animal. "They took him." Paige Veronica wailed, her voice distorted by static and hysteria. "The police came into the boardroom. They put him in handcuffs. They dragged your father out like a common criminal." Paige went pale, her hand gripping the phone so tight her knuckles turned white. "What are you talking about, Mom? Who took him?" Paige asked, her voice rising in panic. "Daddy is the vice president. He was supposed to meet the new owner today. He met him." Veronica sobbed. It was Silas. Paige froze. The world seemed to stop spinning. "Who?" Paige whispered. Silas, Veronica screamed. "Silas Mercer, Trey's father. He owns the company Paige. He owns Vanguard. He owns everything. He fired your father. He had him arrested for embezzlement. They are seizing the house. They took the cars. We have nothing. You have to talk to him. You have to fix this." The line went dead. Paige lowered the phone slowly, her eyes wide with a terror that went beyond financial ruin. It was the terror of a person who realizes they have been mocking a sleeping dragon. She looked up at Trey, who had stopped pacing and was staring at her with wide, fearful eyes. "Did you hear that?" Trey asked, his voice trembling. "He is the CEO," Paige whispered. "Your father, the mechanic, the man sleeping in the basement. He just bought my father's company." Trey sank onto one of the suitcases, putting his head in his hands. "I knew he had money," Trey muttered. "I knew he had savings, but I didn't know he was this." Paige stood up abruptly, smoothing her wrinkled dress. Her mind was racing, calculating, spinning. The fear was being replaced by a desperate manic energy. She wasn't sorry. She was terrified of being poor. She realized instantly that her entire strategy had to change. The bullying was over. The seduction had to begin. "We have to fix this, Trey," she said, pulling him up by his collar. "He is coming back here. I know he is. This is his house. We have to be ready." "Ready for what?" Trey asked. "To apologize, you idiot," Paige snapped. "We have to make him believe we love him. We have to make him believe it was all a misunderstanding, a joke, stress, anything. If he owns Vanguard, he is worth millions. We can't lose that." Before Trey could answer, the sound of a heavy engine purring down the street silenced them both. It wasn't the rattle of my old Ford pickup. It was the smooth, deep rumble of a Bentley. The black car turned into the driveway, its polished chrome gleaming in the afternoon sun. It stopped right in front of the pile of luggage, blocking their path to the street. The driver's door opened, and a uniformed chauffeur stepped out. He walked around to the back and opened the door. I stepped out. I was still wearing the midnight blue suit from London. The fabric caught the light, shimmering slightly. I adjusted my platinum cufflinks and buttoned my jacket. I didn't look like the man who mowed the lawn. I didn't look like the man who fixed the sink. I looked like the man who could buy the neighborhood. I stood there for a moment just looking at them, Trey in his wrinkled polo shirt looking like a lost child, Paige with her mascara running looking like a desperate socialite clinging to a sinking ship. Daddy, Paige screamed. It was a sound I had never heard her make. It was shrill, fake, and dripping with a sweetness that made my teeth ache. She didn't walk toward me. She ran. She threw herself across the grass, ignoring the fact that her expensive heels were sinking into the dirt. She reached me and dropped to her knees right there on the driveway. She wrapped her arms around my legs, burying her face in the expensive wool of my trousers. "Daddy, I am so sorry," she sobbed, loud theatrical tears. "We just heard. It was all a joke. You know that, right? We were just stressed about the wedding. We love you. We are so proud of you." I looked down at her. I felt nothing. No pity, no anger, just a cold detachment. She was staining my suit with her makeup. "Get off me," I said. My voice was calm, but it carried the weight of the boardroom I had just left. Paige flinched, but didn't let go. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and pleading. "Please, Daddy," she begged. "Do not be like this. We are family." I know I said some things, but I was trying to fit in with my dad. You know how Richard is. He is a bully. He made me do it. But you are the hero. You are the genius. I always told Trey his father was special. The lie was so blatant it was almost impressive. Just 24 hours ago, she had called me a pig. Now she was throwing her own father under the bus to save her access to my wallet. Trey walked up behind her slowly. He didn't kneel. He couldn't quite bring himself to that level of debasement yet. But he looked at me with eyes that were wet with tears. "Dad, is it true?" Trey asked, his voice cracking. "Did you really buy Vanguard?" "Yes," I said. "Why didn't you tell us?" Trey asked, a whine creeping into his tone. "Why did you let us treat you like that if you had all this money?" I looked at my son. He still didn't get it. He thought the money was the point. He thought if he had known I was rich, he would have treated me with respect. And that was exactly the problem, because I wanted to know who you were when you thought I had nothing, I said. And now I know. Paige tightened her grip on my legs. "We can change," she cried. "We can be better. Let us back in. Please, Silas. My dad, he is going to jail. My mom is losing her house. We have nowhere to go. You have so much room here. We can be a real family now. I will cook. I will clean. I will never ask for a dime. Just don't leave us on the street." I reached down and peeled her hands off my legs. I did it with the same clinical precision I used to dismantle a transmission. I took a step back, putting distance between us. I brushed the spot where she had touched me as if wiping away dirt. "Do not touch this suit," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "It cost $5,000. And your hands are filthy." Paige fell back onto her heels, sitting in the dirt, her mouth open in shock. She had expected me to melt. She had expected the old Silas, the one who craved connection, to forgive her instantly. But that man didn't live here anymore. I reached into my inside pocket. I didn't pull out a check. I pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a formal legal document Arya had prepared for me an hour ago. I tossed it onto her lap. "This is a notice to vacate," I said. "It is effective immediately. You are trespassing on private property." Trey stepped forward, his face flushing red. "Dad, you can't do this. This is my house. You said it was my house. I never signed the deed, Trey," I said. "It is my house, and I do not want tenants who steal from me." "Steal?" Trey sputtered. "We never stole." "You stole my dignity," I said. "You stole my trust. And you tried to steal my freedom with that $20,000 you tried to withdraw this morning." Trey went silent. He knew I knew. "But where will we go?" Paige wailed, clutching the eviction notice. "We have no money. You froze the accounts." I looked at the sprawling lawn, at the beautiful house I had worked so hard for. "That is not my problem," I said. "You are young. You are healthy. Get a job." "A job?" Paige spat the word like it was poison. "Doing what?" I looked at her manicured hands. "I hear they are hiring cleaners at the mall," I said. "You like shopping so much you might as well work there." I turned my back on them. I walked toward the front door. I took out my keys, the golden key to the front door that I had kept hidden. "Dad, wait," Trey called out. "Please, just give us a chance." I stopped. I didn't turn around. "I gave you a lifetime of chances, Trey," I said. "You spent them all." I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house was cool and quiet. It smelled of lemon polish and silence. I closed the heavy oak door behind me. I turned the deadbolt. The click echoed through the hallway. I walked to the window and looked out through the blinds. Paige was screaming at Trey, now hitting his chest with her fists. Trey was just standing there looking at the closed door. They were alone. They were broke. and for the first time in their lives, they were going to have to survive on their own merit. I turned away from the window. I had a dinner reservation at the finest steakhouse in the city. I was meeting Arya to celebrate. I needed to change out of this suit. I didn't want to wear the clothes that Paige had touched. I walked up the stairs to the master bedroom, my room. It was time to take it back. The storm had passed, and the only thing left standing was the truth. I stood in the center of the master bedroom, staring at the empty spaces on the walls where my pictures used to hang. The pale squares on the wallpaper were like ghosts of the life I had lived before my son decided to erase me. I could hear the faint sound of sobbing coming from the hallway downstairs. I had unlocked the front door one last time, not because I was softening, but because I needed closure. I needed to look my son in the eye without his wife whispering poison into his ear. I needed to know if there was anything left of the boy I had raised inside the stranger standing in my foyer. I walked to the top of the stairs. Trey was sitting on the bottom step, his head in his hands. He looked up when he heard my footsteps. His face was a mask of misery. His eyes were red and swollen. He stood up slowly, wiping his nose with the back of his hand like a child who had been scolded on the playground. "Dad," he said, his voice cracking. "You have to listen to me. Please." Paige is outside in the car screaming, but I told her to stay there. I needed to talk to you man to man. I descended the stairs slowly. My hand glided over the polished wood of the banister. I remembered staining this wood myself 20 years ago. I remembered a 5-year-old Trey helping me hold the sandpaper, his little face covered in dust, beaming with pride because he was helping his daddy. I stopped 3 steps from the bottom. I was taller than him from this vantage point. I looked down at the man he had become. "I am listening, Trey," I said. He took a breath, trying to compose himself. "Dad, look. I know we messed up. I know Paige went too far. She has a big mouth and she is spoiled. I get it. But you can't punish me for her mistakes. I am your son. I am the only family you have left. Mom would not want this. She would not want to see us fighting like this." He played the mom card. It was a desperate move, a low blow. He knew Beatrice was my weak spot. He knew I had spent the last 2 decades trying to be enough for him because she wasn't there. "Do not speak her name," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Your mother would be heartbroken, Trey. Not because we are fighting, but because of what you allowed to happen. You stood there and watched them strip my dignity away, and you did nothing." I was scared. Dad, Trey pleaded, stepping closer to the stairs. "You do not know what it is like with them. The Sterlings, they are intense. They have money. They have power. Or at least I thought they did. I just wanted to fit in. I wanted to be someone. I didn't want to be the mechanic's kid anymore." He stopped, realizing what he had just said. The truth had slipped out. "The mechanic's kid," I repeated, letting the words hang in the air between us. Trey looked down at his shoes. They were expensive Italian loafers scuffed from the walk from the bank. "You know what I mean," he muttered. "It is not that I am not proud of you. It is hard, Dad. Growing up, everyone else's dad was a lawyer or a doctor. You came to pick me up from school in that truck, and you had grease under your fingernails. You smelled like gasoline. The other kids made fun of me. I just wanted to get away from that life. I wanted to be clean." I walked down the final 3 steps. I stood on the marble floor of the foyer. I was wearing a $5,000 suit. I smelled of expensive cologne and success, but inside I was still that mechanic, and my son had just confirmed my deepest fear. He didn't hate me. He was ashamed of me. "Let me tell you about that smell, Trey," I said, walking past him toward the living room. He followed me like a puppy. "That smell you hate so much," I continued, turning to face him. "That was the smell of survival. That grease under my nails was the reason you never went hungry. Do you remember when you were 10 and you wanted that telescope for Christmas? The one that cost $300. Trey nodded, tears welling in his eyes again. "I worked overtime for 3 weeks to buy that for you," I said. "I fixed transmissions in a freezing garage until my fingers were so numb I couldn't hold a fork. I came home smelling like oil because I was building the foundation for your life. I took the dirt so you could be clean." "I did not know," Trey whispered. "You did not know because I protected you," I said, my voice rising. "I hid the struggle from you. I let you believe that money just appeared. I let you believe that you were entitled to a soft life. And that was my mistake. I created a weak man because I didn't want you to have a hard childhood. Trey reached out to touch my arm, but I stepped back. Dad, I am sorry, he cried. I am so sorry. I was weak. I was a coward. But I love you. You have to believe that. I didn't mean to laugh at the wedding. It just happened. Everyone was laughing. I didn't want to be the only one not laughing. That is the definition of a coward, Trey, I said. You laughed because it was easier than defending me. You laughed because you wanted Richard Sterling's approval more than you wanted my respect. I looked at him and I saw the truth. He wasn't crying because he hurt me. He was crying because the ATM had stopped working. He was crying because the lifestyle he felt entitled to was vanishing before his eyes. He was mourning his comfort, not our relationship. You said you wanted to be someone, I said. You wanted to get away from the mechanic's life. Well, congratulations, Trey. You got your wish. What do you mean, Trey asked, wiping his face. I mean that you are free, I said. You do not have to be associated with the mechanic anymore. You do not have to put up with the old fat pig. You are on your own. Trey's eyes widened in panic. Dad, no. You can't mean that. We have nothing. Paige's dad is in jail. We have no house. We have no money. You have millions. You can't just cut me off. It is cruel. It is not cruel, I said. It is education. You are 30 years old, Trey. You have a degree that I paid for. You have health. You have a wife who claims to be brilliant. Go out there and build something. Prove to me that you are more than just a leech. But the inheritance, Trey blurted out. The trust fund. You always said everything you built was for me. I walked over to the fireplace. Above the mantel there used to be a portrait of our family. Now there was just a blank space. I lied, I said. Trey froze. What? I said I lied. I told you that to see what you would do. I wanted to see if you would wait for me to die or if you would try to make something of yourself. I got my answer. You were waiting for the funeral, Trey. You and Paige were counting the days. That is not true, he protested, but his eyes betrayed him. It is true, I said. And because of that, the trust is dissolved. I met with Arya this morning before I went to the office. I signed the papers. Trey grabbed his hair, pulling at it in frustration. Dissolved. Where did the money go? It is gone, I said. I moved it. I put it into a charitable remainder trust. It will go to fund scholarships for trade schools, for mechanics, for plumbers, for the people who aren't afraid to get their hands dirty, for the people who don't laugh at their fathers. Trey fell to his knees on the rug. It was a theatrical gesture, but the despair was real. The safety net was gone. The golden parachute had been set on fire. You can't do this, he sobbed. I am your son. Blood is thicker than water. Blood means nothing if there is no loyalty, I said, looking down at him. You chose your side, Trey. You chose the Sterlings. You chose the people who mocked me. You cannot have it both ways. You cannot eat at my table and spit in my face. I walked toward the door. I opened it wide. The afternoon heat poured in. I could see Paige sitting in the passenger seat of the Bentley I had repossessed but hadn't yet collected. She was looking at the house with hungry, desperate eyes. Get out, Trey, I said. He looked up at me. He looked broken. He looked like a man who had woken up from a dream to find himself in a nightmare. Dad, please, he whispered one last time. Goodbye, son, I said. He stood up shakily. He walked past me, his head hung low. He didn't look back. He walked out the door and down the steps. He got into the car with his wife. I watched them drive away. They were heading nowhere. They were heading into a world that didn't care about their last name or their designer clothes. They were heading into the reality I had shielded them from for too long. I closed the door. I locked it. The house was silent. I was alone. I walked back to the living room and sat in my armchair. I felt a tear roll down my cheek. It was hot and salty. I let it fall. I didn't wipe it away. It hurt. It hurt more than the day I buried my wife, because that day I lost her to God. Today I lost my son to greed. But as the silence settled around me, I also felt something else. I felt clean. The toxic weight of his shame was gone. The burden of supporting his lies was gone. I looked at my hands. They were manicured now, soft. but I flexed my fingers, remembering the strength that was still there. I was Silas Mercer. I had built an empire. I had destroyed my enemies, and I had the courage to cut off my own limb to save the body. I stood up. I had a foundation to launch. I had students to help. I had a legacy to build that would actually last. Trey was the past. The future was mine to write. And I wasn't going to waste another second of it looking back. The flickering neon sign of the motel room buzzed outside the window, casting a sickly green light over the stained carpet. Paige sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, holding her phone with a grip so tight her knuckles were white. Trey was curled up in the corner of the room, staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper. He had checked out mentally hours ago, but Paige was not done fighting. She was cornered. She was broke. She was humiliated. And like a rat in a trap, she was going to bite. She didn't have her professional lighting or her designer backdrop. She had a greasy lens and a face swollen from crying. She decided to use that. She messed up her hair even more. She smudged her mascara to look like bruises. She wanted the world to see a victim. She opened the livestream app. She had thousands of followers from her days as a socialite. She typed a caption that she knew would grab attention. The truth about Silas Mercer, the monster who ruined my life. She hit the go live button. I watched it happen in real time from my office at Vanguard Tech. Aria had alerted me the moment the notification went out. We projected the feed onto the wall of the conference room. "Hey everyone," Paige whispered into her phone, her voice trembling with a practiced fragility. "I am sorry I look like this. I have been crying for days. I am hiding in a motel room because I am terrified." She sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "You all saw the news about my father, Richard Sterling. You saw that he was arrested. But what the media is not telling you is that he was framed. He was framed by a man named Silas Mercer. A man I called father-in-law. A man who is actually a monster." She leaned closer to the camera, her eyes wide and manic. "Silas Mercer is not a businessman. He is a criminal. He runs a money laundering operation through his investment firm. Vanguard Tech is just a front. He took over the company to hide his illegal assets. And when my father found out Silas destroyed him, the viewer count on her stream was ticking up rapidly. 5,000, 10,000. The internet loved a scandal, especially one involving a mysterious billionaire. But that is not the worst part," Paige continued, letting a single tear roll down her cheek. "He is violent. He hits us. He kept me and Trey prisoners in his house. He forced us to live in fear. Look at this." She pointed to a small bruise on her arm, probably from bumping into the doorframe of the Bentley yesterday. "He did this when he threw us out on the street. He laughed while he did it. He told us that if we ever spoke up, he would kill us. He has the police in his pocket. He has judges on his payroll. We have nowhere to go. Please, someone help us. We are just innocent people trying to survive a tyrant." I watched as the comments section exploded with outrage. People were calling for my arrest. They were tagging the FBI. They were threatening to boycott Vanguard Tech. The stock price, which had held steady during the transition, began to wobble. Aria looked at me from across the table. Her face was grim. "This is getting traction, Silas," she said. "The narrative is shifting. People love a victim story. Even if it is a lie, it can do real damage to the brand. The board is already getting calls." I leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers. I watched Paige sob on the screen. She was good. She was very good. She had tapped into the primal desire of the mob to tear down the powerful. She was using my own success as a weapon against me. "Let her talk," I said calmly. "Let her dig the hole a little deeper." But Silas Aria argued, the accusations of money laundering, the abuse allegations. "This could trigger a federal investigation. It could freeze our assets. Let them investigate," I said. "My books are cleaner than a church on Sunday. But Aria, we are not going to issue a press release. We are not going to hide behind a spokesperson." "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I am going to hold a press conference," I said, "tonight, right here in the lobby. Invite every major news outlet. Tell them I am going to address the allegations personally. And Aria, yes, set up a screen in the lobby, a big one, and make sure we have a direct line to the local precinct." By 7 o'clock that evening, the lobby of Vanguard Tech was packed with reporters. The cameras were set up. The microphones were hot. Outside, a crowd of protesters had gathered chanting justice for Paige. They held signs calling me a predator. They didn't know me. They didn't know the truth. They only knew the lie that had been fed to them by a desperate woman in a motel room. I walked out to the podium. I was alone. I didn't have a team of lawyers standing behind me. I didn't need them. I wore the same suit I had worn to fire Richard. I looked every bit the CEO. I stood in the glare of the flashbulbs waiting for the noise to die down. "Mr. Mercer, is it true you launder money?" a reporter shouted. "Did you strike your daughter-in-law?" Another yelled. "Why did you frame Richard Sterling?" I raised my hand. The room fell silent. The authority I had cultivated over 40 years of hard labor and hard business decisions radiated from me. "I am here to address the accusations made by Mrs. Paige Mercer," I said, my voice steady and deep. "I have heard her story, I have seen her tears, and I understand why you are angry. If what she said was true, I would be angry too." I paused, looking directly into the camera lens. I knew Paige was watching. I knew she was sitting in that motel room thinking she had won, thinking she had destroyed me. But the truth is a stubborn thing. I continued. "It does not bend to tears. It does not break under pressure. Mrs. Mercer claims she is a victim. She claims I'm a tyrant who wants to silence her. She claims she loves me and only wanted to protect her family." I pressed a button on the remote control I held in my hand. The massive screen behind me flickered to life. "I believe in transparency," I said. "So let us look at the truth together." The video that began to play was not from the wedding. It was not from the bank. It was the recording from the living room. The recording I had made the day before I revealed myself. The audio boomed through the lobby crystal clear. "Doctor, I do not care about the ethical guidelines," Paige's voice hissed from the speakers. "We are running out of time. I need a signature, doctor. I need a medical affidavit stating that Silas Mercer is suffering from advanced dementia and requires immediate secure custodial care." The reporters gasped. Pens stopped writing. Cameras zoomed in on the screen. The recording continued. $20,000, Evans' voice said. "Cash. Fine." Paige's voice replied, cold and calculating. "I will have the cash by Friday. Just get the papers ready. I want him in a facility by the weekend, somewhere far away. I do not want him wandering back here." I let the recording play to the end. I let them hear her laugh after she hung up. I let them hear the sound of a woman plotting to kidnap and imprison an innocent man for profit. Then I clicked the next file. It was the video from the wedding, the moment she took the microphone. "This is the old fat pig we have to put up with," Paige's voice slurred on the screen. "Look at him. He smells like grease. But Trey promised me he stays in the basement so he won't ruin our aesthetic." The silence in the lobby was absolute. The protesters outside had gone quiet as the audio was piped to the external speakers. The image of the crying victim Paige had constructed was shattering into a million pieces. I turned off the screen. "This is the woman who claims I abused her," I said. "This is the woman who claims I am a criminal. A woman who plotted to bribe a doctor to declare me insane so she could steal my home. A woman who publicly humiliated me while spending my money." I looked at the cameras again. I did not evict them because I am cruel. I evicted them because they are criminals. I did not freeze their accounts because I am greedy. I froze them because the money was mine, and they were using it to pay for my own imprisonment. I picked up a file from the podium. "As for the allegations of money laundering, here are the audited financials of Mercer Equity, certified by the top 3 accounting firms in the country. They are available for your review. And here are the police reports regarding Richard Sterling's embezzlement." I dropped the file on the podium. Paige Mercer is not a whistleblower. She is a con artist who got caught, and she is using your empathy as a weapon to avoid the consequences of her actions. At that exact moment in the motel room, Paige stared at her phone in horror. The comments on her live stream, which was still running in the background, had turned. The sympathy was gone. The mob had realized they were being played. "Liar," the comments scrolled. "You tried to lock him up. You are the monster. Justice for Silas." Paige scrambled to turn off the phone, but her hands were shaking too hard. She dropped it on the floor. Suddenly, there was a loud banging on the motel room door. "Police, open up!" a voice shouted. "No," Paige whispered, backing away until she hit the wall. "Not now. Not like this." The door burst open. 4 officers swarmed the small room. They weren't there for a noise complaint. They were there on a warrant Arya and I had sworn out hours ago. Paige Mercer, one officer shouted, pulling her hands behind her back. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit medical fraud, attempted kidnapping, and extortion. Trey sat on the bed, motionless, watching his wife get handcuffed. He didn't move to help her. He looked at the phone on the floor, which was still broadcasting. He looked at the image of his father on the screen, standing tall and powerful. "I am sorry, Dad," Trey whispered to the screen. Back in the lobby, I wrapped up my speech. I have spent my life building things, I said. I build companies. I build value. I tried to build a family. But sometimes you have to tear a structure down to the foundation to remove the rot. Thank you. I walked off the stage. The reporters shouted questions, but the tone had changed. They weren't accusing anymore. They were respectful. They were asking for details on the prosecution. They were on my side. I walked back to the elevator. The same elevator Richard had blocked. The guard who had tried to stop me yesterday was gone, replaced by a professional security team I had vetted myself. I rode up to the top floor alone. I walked into my office and turned on the TV. The news was already showing the footage of Paige being led out of the motel in handcuffs. She was screaming, cursing my name, but nobody was listening anymore. I poured myself a glass of water. My hands were steady. The final blow had been struck. The lies were exposed. The reputation of Mercer Equity was safe. But as I looked out at the city lights, I didn't feel triumph. I felt a heavy finality. I had won the war, but the battlefield was covered in the wreckage of what used to be my life. My son was collateral damage. My home was a crime scene. It was necessary. I knew that. But it didn't make the silence in the office feel any less lonely. I drank the water. I turned off the TV. I had work to do. There was always work to do. And tomorrow I would start building something new, something that couldn't be broken by greed or lies. The fall of the House of Sterling was not a slow decline. It was a controlled demolition. In the weeks following the arrest and the press conference, the legal machinery of Mercer Equity dismantled what was left of their lives with the dispassionate efficiency of a trash compactor. I didn't have to lift a finger personally. Aria and her team of sharks handled the details while I focused on stabilizing Vanguard tech. Richard Sterling did not handle incarceration well. The man who had strutted through the lobby demanding respect crumbled the moment he was stripped of his Italian suit and forced into an orange jumpsuit that did not hide his gut. He tried to cut a deal. He offered to give up names of other executives who might be skimming off the top, but he had no leverage. We had the forensic accounting. We knew he had acted alone, driven by a greed so singular it was almost impressive. He pled guilty to avoid a public trial that would have aired even more of his dirty laundry. The judge was not lenient. He sentenced Richard to 7 years in a medium-security federal prison for wire fraud and embezzlement. I read the report from the sentencing hearing. Richard had wept openly, begging the judge for mercy, citing his high blood pressure and his standing in the community. The judge reminded him that stealing $500,000 from a company to buy luxury cars was not the behavior of a community pillar. His assets were seized to pay restitution to Vanguard Tech. The silver Mercedes S-Class, the one he had forced me to park, was sold at a police auction for a fraction of its value. His estate, the sprawling mansion where he had laughed at me, was foreclosed upon by the bank. Veronica Sterling fared no better. She was not charged with a crime, but she was guilty of willful ignorance. When the assets were frozen, she discovered that her husband had leveraged everything they owned to maintain their lifestyle. There were no savings. There was no secret nest egg. There was only debt. She was evicted from the mansion 3 weeks after Richard's arrest. I heard through the grapevine that she had moved into a small one-bedroom apartment on the other side of the city. The socialite who had sneered at my simple life was now working as a greeter at a department store. She spent her days standing on her feet, forcing smiles at customers who ignored her, holding doors for people who had more money than she did. It was a poetic justice that I didn't even have to script. The woman who measured human worth by bank account balance had been reduced to minimum wage. And then there was Paige, the daughter-in-law who had called me a pig, the woman who had tried to kidnap me with a signature. The charges against her were severe: conspiracy to commit medical fraud, attempted kidnapping, extortion. Because she had no prior criminal record, her lawyer managed to keep her out of prison, but the plea deal was brutal. She received 5 years of probation, a hefty fine that she couldn't pay, and 2,000 hours of community service. The last time I saw a picture of Paige, it was in the local paper. She was wearing an orange safety vest, holding a trash picker, walking along the side of the interstate. Her hair was frizzy, her makeup was gone. She was picking up discarded fast food wrappers and cigarette butts. The caption identified her as part of a court-mandated cleanup crew. She looked miserable, she looked broken, and she looked exactly like she deserved. She couldn't get a job in any office. A background check flagged her immediately as a fraud risk. She was living in a basement apartment, ironically enough, rented by her mother. She was trapped in the very existence she had tried to force upon me. I didn't rejoice in their suffering. I simply observed it as the natural consequence of their actions. They had thrown a stone straight up into the air and were surprised when it fell back down on their own heads. The cleanup was complete. The sterlings were erased from my ledger. But there was one loose end that still tugged at the back of my mind. One account that hadn't been fully closed. 3 months after the dust had settled, I found myself driving through the industrial district on the south side of the city. I wasn't in the Bentley. I was driving my old Ford truck. I found comfort in the rattle of the engine and the worn leather of the steering wheel. It reminded me of where I came from. I turned down a street lined with auto body shops and warehouses. I was looking for a specific address. Arya had told me where he was. She kept tabs on him, not because I asked her to, but because she was thorough. I saw the sign, Sparkle Hand Wash. It was a run-down operation, a concrete lot with a few bays and a team of men working in the midday heat. I pulled the truck to the curb across the street and killed the engine. I rolled down the window, letting the sounds of the city wash over me. The hiss of power washers, the bass of a radio playing from a nearby garage. I scanned the workers, and then I saw him. Trey was wearing a soaking wet gray t-shirt and rubber boots. He was holding a soapy sponge, scrubbing the rim of a black SUV. He looked thinner. His face was tanned from working outside. His hair was longer unkempt. He didn't look like the boy who had worn a tuxedo at the Platinum Sands Resort. He looked like a man who was tired. I watched him work. He wasn't slacking off. He was scrubbing hard, putting his back into it. He rinsed the wheel, then moved to the next one. He didn't complain to the other workers. He just kept his head down and focused on the task. The smell of the car wash drifted across the street. Soap, wax, dirty water. It wasn't motor oil, but it was close. It was the smell of manual labor. It was the smell he had spent his whole life running away from. The smell he had been ashamed of when it was on my skin. Now it was on his. He finished the car and wiped his forehead with his forearm, leaving a streak of suds on his skin. He turned to grab a towel, and that was when he saw the truck. He froze. He knew the truck. He had ridden in the passenger seat 1,000 times. He looked across the street. Our eyes locked. The distance between us was only 50 feet, but it felt like an ocean. I saw a flicker of hope in his eyes. He took a half step forward. He probably thought I had come to save him. He probably thought the punishment was over, that I had seen enough suffering and was ready to open the gates of paradise again. He looked at the truck, waiting for me to wave, waiting for me to signal him to come over. I looked at his hands. They were red and chapped. They were working hands. For the first time in his life, my son was earning his bread. He wasn't leeching. He wasn't pretending. He was surviving. I felt a pang of sorrow deep in my chest. I wanted to get out. I wanted to tell him it was okay. I wanted to buy the car wash and give it to him, but I knew I couldn't. If I saved him now, I would destroy him forever. If I pulled him out of the mud before he learned how to stand, he would never be a man. He would go back to being the coward who laughed when his wife called his father a pig. The hope in Trey's eyes began to fade as I didn't move. He lowered his hand. He looked at his boots. He understood. I wasn't there to rescue him. I was there to witness him. He looked back up at me. He nodded. It wasn't a beg. It was an acknowledgement. He straightened his back slightly. He turned around, walked back to the SUV, and picked up the chamois cloth. He started drying the hood. He was working. I put the truck in gear. I didn't honk. I didn't wave. I pulled away from the curb and drove down the street. I watched him in the rearview mirror until he was just a gray speck in the distance. He was scrubbing a car for minimum wage. He was living in a cheap apartment. He had lost his wife, his inheritance, and his ease. But as I turned the corner, I realized something important. He finally smelled like a man. I drove back toward the city, toward the skyscraper that bore my name. I had a meeting with the board. I had a foundation to run. My life was full. Trey had a long road ahead of him. Maybe one day, years from now, he would find his way back to my door. Maybe he would knock not as a beggar, but as an equal. Maybe he would have his own stories of struggle and survival. Until then, I would let him wash the cars. I would let him learn the value of $1. I would let him become Silas Mercer's son the hard way. I turned on the radio. The sun was shining. The engine hummed. I was alone, But I wasn't lonely. I was right where I belonged. And for the first time in his life, so was Trey. The for sale sign on the front lawn of the house on Elm Street was not just a piece of painted wood, it was a tombstone for a life that no longer existed. I stood on the sidewalk looking at the colonial structure that had been the center of my world for 15 years. It was a beautiful house. It had good bones. It had a new roof and updated wiring. But to me, it looked like a mausoleum. I walked up the driveway past the spot where Paige had fallen to her knees and begged for my money. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the foyer. The house was empty. I had hired a crew to come in 2 days ago. I told them to take everything. The furniture Paige had picked out, the electronics Trey had bought, the rugs, the curtains, everything that carried the scent of their entitlement was gone. I donated it all to a shelter for families displaced by fires. It seemed fitting. My house had burned down metaphorically, so I would help people whose houses had burned down literally. The only thing remaining was the echo of my footsteps on the hardwood floors. I walked to the kitchen. This was where I had cooked breakfast for Trey every morning before school. This was where I had sat alone eating dinner while he was out with his new rich friends. The memories were there, but they didn't hurt anymore. They felt like scenes from a movie I had watched a long time ago. I walked to the basement door. It was open. I descended the stairs into the cool, damp air. The cot was gone. The workbench was gone. The safe hidden in the floor was empty, and the panel had been sealed shut with fresh concrete. I stood in the center of the room. This was where they had tried to bury me. This was where they had thrown my clothes in garbage bags. This was where I had plotted their destruction. I didn't feel anger looking at the concrete walls. I felt gratitude. The basement had been my crucible. It was the place where the heat of their disrespect had burned away the last of my weakness. If they hadn't put me down here, I might have kept enabling them. I might have died, leaving them a fortune they would have squandered. The basement saved me. I walked back up the stairs and closed the door. I locked it. I would never go down there again. I met the realtor in the living room. She was a nice woman named Brenda who had sold me the house years ago. She looked around the empty space and smiled. "It shows well, Silas," she said. "The market is hot. I can get you 20% over asking price by the end of the week." I shook my head. "I do not want a bidding war, Brenda," I said. "I want you to find a young couple, someone starting out, someone who works with their hands, maybe a mechanic or a carpenter. Sell it to them for what I paid for it 15 years ago." Brenda looked at me like I was crazy. "Silas, that is hundreds of thousands of dollars under market value. You are leaving money on the table." "I have enough money," I said. "I want this house to have a fresh start. It needs honest energy. It needs people who will appreciate the roof over their heads, not people who think they are too good for it. Find me a family that needs a break." She nodded slowly, tears forming in her eyes. "I will find them, Silas. I promise." I handed her the keys. The heavy brass ring felt light in my hand. I walked out the front door and down the steps. I didn't look back. The house was just wood and brick. My home was wherever I was. I got into my truck. I still drove it on weekends. It kept me grounded. I drove to the city, to the glass and steel tower that housed the headquarters of Mercer Equity. I took the elevator to the top floor, but I didn't go to my office. I went to the boardroom. The long mahogany table was covered in white tablecloths. There were flowers in the center. But this wasn't a party for shareholders. It was the first meeting of the Board of Trustees for the Beatrice Mercer Foundation. I sat at the head of the table. Aria was to my right. Around the table were social workers, doctors, educators, and community leaders. These were the people who were going to help me spend my fortune. I stood up to speak. I looked at the faces looking back at me. They didn't see a pig. They didn't see a checkbook. They saw a partner. "Welcome," I said. For a long time, I built wealth for the sake of security. I built it because I was afraid of being powerless. I thought money was a wall I could build around myself to keep the world out. I paused, thinking of Beatrice, thinking of the hospital room where she died because we were poor. But I learned recently that a wall can also be a prison. I continued. If you hoard your blessings, they turn stagnant. They rot. I saw what money did to my son. It didn't make him free. It made him weak. It made him cruel. I picked up the mission statement we had drafted. "The Beatrice Mercer Foundation is not a tax shelter," I said firmly. "It is a weapon. We are going to fight the system that preys on the elderly. We are going to provide top-tier legal defense for seniors who are being exploited by their families. We are going to fund investigations into corrupt guardianships. No one should ever have to fear their own children. There were nods around the table. And secondly, I said, we are going to honor the dignity of labor. We are creating the Mercer Trade Scholarship. We will pay full tuition for any young man or woman who wants to become a mechanic, a plumber, an electrician, or a welder. We are going to teach them that there is no shame in dirt under your fingernails. We are going to teach them that the people who build the world deserve to own a piece of it. I sat down. The room broke into applause. It wasn't polite applause, it was passionate. We got to work, we approved grants, we hired staff. We allocated millions of dollars to causes that would actually change lives. For the first time in my life, I understood what true wealth was. It wasn't the number in the bank account. It wasn't the suit or the watch or the car. True wealth was the ability to change the ending of the story. It was the power to protect the vulnerable. It was the freedom to act according to your conscience without fear of consequence. Richard Sterling had chased status and ended up in a cage. Trey had chased ease and ended up in a car wash. I had chased the truth, and I had ended up here in a room full of people who wanted to do good. That evening, I left the office and drove to the marina. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. The obsidian bobbed gently in her slip. I boarded the yacht and walked to the aft deck. I poured myself a glass of wine. It was the same vintage I had poured on Richard's lap. It tasted better tonight. It tasted like justice. I sat in the deck chair and looked out at the horizon. The city lights were twinkling in the distance. Somewhere out there, my son was probably finishing his shift, wringing out towels, his back aching. I felt a phantom pain in my own back, remembering the years I spent doing the same. I missed him. I missed the little boy who used to think I was a superhero because I could fix his bicycle. But I knew that boy was gone long before the wedding. He had been slowly eroded by a society that told him his value came from what he consumed, not what he created. I took a sip of wine. They called me a pig. I thought about that insult. Paige had meant it to mean I was dirty, greedy, ugly. But she didn't know anything about nature. A domestic pig is lazy. It sits in a pen and waits to be fed. It gets fat and slow, and eventually it gets eaten. That was Richard. That was Trey. They were the domestic pigs waiting at the trough of my generosity. But a wild pig is different. A wild pig is a survivor. It can live in the harshest environments. It is intelligent. It has thick skin that protects it from thorns and predators. It roots in the earth to find sustenance. And if you corner a wild pig, if you threaten its existence, it will fight with a ferocity that can kill a tiger. I was the wild pig. I had survived the poverty of my youth. I had survived the death of my wife. I had survived the betrayal of my son. I had rooted in the dirt and I had found gold. I swirled the wine in the glass, watching the red liquid catch the last light of the sun. I had tusks she never saw coming. I put the glass down. The air was getting cool. I stood up and walked to the railing. I looked down at the dark water. The reflection of the moon danced on the surface. I was 68 years old. I was alone, but I was not lonely. I had Arya. I had the foundation. I had the memory of Beatrice, which was finally peaceful, not painful. I had reclaimed my name. I had reclaimed my house, even if I sold it. I had reclaimed my life. I took a deep breath of the salty air. It smelled clean. No grease, no oil, no lies. I turned and walked back into the cabin. I had a meeting in the morning with a group of scholarship students, future mechanics, future builders. I needed to get some rest. The old man was gone. The pig was gone. Silas Mercer was here, and he had a lot of work left to do. The most painful lesson I learned wasn't about money, but about value. I realized that true wealth isn't measured by the balance in your bank account or the brand of your suit, but by your integrity and the peace of mind that comes from living authentically. My son chased the illusion of status and lost everything that actually mattered, while I found my strength in the very humble roots he despised. I learned that family isn't defined by blood, but by loyalty and respect. Sometimes the greatest act of love isn't shielding someone from the storm, but letting them stand in the rain so they can finally learn how to grow. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more life stories. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had to cut off a toxic family member to protect your own peace? I read every single comment. Until next time.